Good evening. Welcome to the English Language Leaders Debate. For the next 2 hours, we will hear from the 4 major political leaders. They will be answering questions from a panel of journalists, and they will be debating the issues arising from those questions. There will be one-on-one debates, and the leaders will get a chance to tackle the issues in more of a free-for-all as well. The evening will be divided into 4 segments, with each segment devoted to a particular theme. But before we get to the questions, each leader will have an opening statement. The order of speaking has been decided by a draw, and there is a set time, so if a leader goes over the time, it will be my job to stop him. And so to begin, here is Gilles Duceppe, leader of the Bloc Québécois.
Good evening. This debate is a unique occasion to talk directly to Quebecers and to Canadians. First of all, I want to be clear. It is out of the question for the Bloc Québécois to form a coalition with the Conservative Party or the Liberal Party. We will determine our position based on Quebec's interest. We will maintain a respectful and responsible attitude towards the Canadian population. We will continue to rigorously do our work in the House of Commons. I invite you to ask yourself the following question. Why is it that none of the 3 other parties can respond to the aspirations of Quebec? The answer is that Quebec is different. Not better, not worse.
Thank you, Mr.
Simply
Duceppe.
different.
Next is the leader of the Liberal Party, Paul Martin.
On June 28th, Canadians will elect either myself or Mr. Harper to serve as Prime Minister. It's a choice that matters because we have very different values and we offer very different prescriptions for the future. My number 1 priority is to fix health care, beginning with the reduction of wait times. Too many Canadians are asked to wait too long for the care that they need. The toll on our parents, on our children and ourselves is simply too high. And this is the issue that worries families most. The question is whether anyone on this stage is prepared to make a difference. Well, I am. And I'm asking for your support to eliminate waiting times with the same determination as we showed in eliminating the deficit.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Next is the leader of the Conservative Party, Stephen Harper.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, this election is not about choosing a country. We're all Canadians. This election is about choosing a government. It's about choosing a government free from 10 years of Liberal waste, mismanagement, and scandal, a government that will be accountable, a government that can be trusted. And for us, it's about giving Canadians a choice between a campaign of fear and falsehood and our campaign that demands better for this country. A Canada with better health care and better results, with a better economy and lower taxes, with better accountability and higher integrity in the federal government. The desire for change in this country is a powerful thing. This evening I'll talk about how together we can achieve it.
Thank you, Mr. Harper. New Democratic Party leader Jack Layton is next.
Well, elections should be about ideas and about hope. And that's what the NDP is all about. Positive ideas for positive change. Things like protecting our environment and building up our communities, investing and innovating in healthcare, not privatizing our healthcare system, opening up doors to education and training, and making life affordable for families. You know, Canadians have been telling me that they are upset with the scandals. They don't want to reward scandals and broken promises and give the Liberals a 4th mandate. They want change, but they're worried about the Conservatives' hidden agenda. So that's why I'm asking you to give the NDP a central role in the new Parliament of Canada. You can make that choice. It's up to you. And put hope back on the stage again.
Thank you, Mr. Layton. Well, thank you all, gentlemen. Now, before we move to the next stage of the debate, I'll just explain to our audience what to expect. The rules and the format of these debates have been agreed to by the parties. This will be different from election debates of recent years. What you'll see in each of the 4 segments is every leader giving an individual response to the first reporter's question. Then a series of one-on-one debates where each leader gets to debate each other leader. That's new this year. And that will be followed by a free-for-all debate among all 4 leaders. Again, there are set times for these segments, and we have a clock. You can see it there. The leaders can see the clock, and they will know when their time is up. Should they keep going? That's where I step in. The parties have agreed that the debating segments are best served if they are as unrestricted as possible. But in the interest of fairness, there are a few rules. If a leader has been trying to make a point and has been unable to do so, or if the discussion becomes such that we can no longer hear or understand what is being said, I will intervene. If a leader uses a prop, that won't be allowed. Well, that gives you an idea of what to expect tonight. Now let me introduce you to the journalists asking the questions. Craig Oliver is the Parliamentary Bureau Chief of CTV. David Viano is the Bureau Chief for Global Television. And Keith Bogue is the Bureau Chief for CBC Television. Our first segment will focus on leadership, trust, and accountability. And to begin, the first question is from Craig Oliver.
Mr. Martin, the underlying issue in this campaign is really believability, trustworthiness. So it won't surprise you to know we're starting with the whole issue of the sponsorship scandal. You were in the cabinet for over 10 years. You were the man in charge of the nation's finances. You were a Quebec minister, moreover, and yet you say you knew nothing about millions of dollars essentially being stolen from the Canadian government and funneled to liberal ad firms. Why should Canadians believe you?
Well, first of all, as leader of the party and as Prime Minister, I take responsibility. I think accountability means you take responsibility for what happens, and I certainly do take responsibility for that. And as a result of that, I've acted very quickly. On my first day in office, I canceled the sponsorship program. The second thing that I did was to put in place a royal commission, a commission of inquiry under Mr. Justice Gomery. He has the widest mandate possible. I told him to leave no stone unturned as to what he is going to be, what he can look into, because I want to get to the bottom of this. And since that time, people have been fired, charges have been laid. Major changes in the way government controls its spending have been done. Believe you me, I want to get to the bottom of this. I want the truth to be out. I could have shoveled this under a carpet. I did not.
Mr. Layton.
Well, we've had 20 years of conservative and liberal governments that have left us with scandals and cronyism in government. It's got to change. And surely the doors need to be opened up in that House of Commons and in that parliamentary system. How are we going to do that? First, we need proportional representation, a fundamental change that will give absolutely every voice of every Canadian an opportunity to be heard. And we're committed to that. Let's get an independent ethics commissioner who can actually get the job done, reporting to Parliament. Certainly hasn't worked to date. And have that person properly funded. Conflict of interest rules have got to be changed. We've got a revolving door of lobbyists in and out of this government that is quite shocking, and Canadians don't like it. Let's get proportional representation also, because that'll bring more women into government.
Thank you, Mr.
And believe
Layton.
me, that'll help clean up.
Mr. Duceppe.
Yesterday, I've asked Paul Martin 4 questions about the sponsorship scandals. He refused to answer, so I'll ask those questions again tonight. Who was the political direction at the head of the sponsorship scandal? Who were those ministers who knew, and are they still members of the federal cabinet? And finally, will he make public the report on the dirty money that the Liberal Party received from their friends in the sponsorship scandals? Yesterday, you refused to answer those questions. You talked about transparency. You have to be transparent. It's your duty, sir, to answer those questions. You said February the 12th, you knew all those questions, you knew the answers to those questions. And since the very beginning of the campaign, you're refusing to answer those questions. So again tonight, I'm asking you those questions. I hope you will answer those questions and face your duty.
Thank you, Mr. Duceppe. Mr. Harper.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Martin had an obligation to be accountable for this scandal through his years as finance minister, and he specifically committed to the Canadian people that he would not call an election until he had answers. He shut down a parliamentary committee, called the election anyway, and even today we are getting new information in Lafleur Communications and some of the elements of this scandal. There's things we can do to correct this and make sure it never happens again. We can have an independent, a genuinely independent ethics commissioner that was promised by this government 11 years ago. We can give more power and more resources to the Auditor General. We can have democratic reform to elect senators. But the most important thing for democratic accountability is a government be replaced when it behaves this way. That's why we created the Conservative Party, to give Canadians a chance to make that change.
Thank you, Mr. Harper. Now we begin the one-on-one debates with a follow-up question from David Viano.
Well, voters coming into this election are extremely cynical. They want more accountability from their politicians. They feel that they've been duped and lied to and by politicians of all political stripes. I mean, they sense that their money has been wasted. Now, here we are again in an election campaign. You're all making a whack of promises. Voters have heard that before. So why is it that Canadians should trust you to keep your promises this time?
Mr. Martin and Mr. Duceppe will be the first two debaters. Mr. Martin.
Well, perhaps I can answer that question, but I'd like to answer Mr. Duceppe's questions as well. In fact, is in terms of political direction, in terms of whoever knew, that is the purpose of creating the special commission of inquiry. There is now a judge in place with subpoena powers, the power to bring people forth. That's his whole purpose, is to get to the bottom of this, and I very much want to get to the bottom of this. As far as the last question is concerned, asked by Mr. Duceppe, in terms of what happened to the monies, did any of it end up in a Liberal Party bank account? The fact is that the report is going to be made available to Mr. Gauthier, who is a special counsel. His whole purpose is to look at where this money has come from. So the fact is that an extensive report has been done that will make that money available to him.
Mr. Martin, don't hide yourself behind the Commission. You said February the 12th. You knew there was a political direction. Obviously, it was not the Tories, neither the NDP or the Bloc direction. It was a Liberal political direction. Then you said if someone knew, he has to tell or resign. Maybe some of the ministers who knew at that time, because you said very few ministers knew. But very few means there's certainly some ministers who knew. Are they still members of your cabinet? And finally, you said you won't campaign with dirty money. Now you have the report in your hand. And you're telling the people, we'll tell you what's in this report after the election.
No.
You think you gain credibility by
let's
acting like that?
Let me just answer.
You have no credibility at all when you're talking about transparency, sir.
I made no accusations. What I did say is that there had to be direction, probably political direction. That's what the.
You
that's
said
why
there were
we
ministers
have, That's
involved.
why we have the Commission of Inquiry. At the same time, I have said that whatever information anybody may have, I want it to come forth. And if anybody knew about this at the time, then they should not.
Also
they do not belong
Mr.
in a cabinet.
Mr.
I
Martin,
could have shoveled all of this under the carpet. I did not do that. I want to know what happened. Canadians are entitled to know
you're
what
not
happened.
the only one.
The truth must come out on this thing, and I can assure you
Duceppe, go ahead.
that it is going to
Mr.
come out.
Martin, you're not the only one who wants to know what happened. The population wants to know what happened.
No doubt about that.
And when you told us there are few ministers knew, we still don't know today if they're members of your own cabinet. How can we believe what you're saying when maybe some of those ministers are member of your cabinet? I mean, you're refusing to answer the question again, and again.
Gentlemen, we have to end it there. Mr. Harper and Mr. Layton are next. Mr. Harper.
Thank you very much. I'm sure Mr. Layton and Mr. Duceppe would agree with me. Our parties all participated on the public accounts inquiry that made some effort to get to the bottom of this, and I'm sure Mr. Layton would agree that despite, I think, very cooperative efforts at the beginning of all parties and by the end of just 3 parties, the government was determined not to get the answers to this scandal before we proceeded to an election campaign. But we all have different proposals on how to deal with the future, so let me just throw one out to Mr. Layton. We've talked about in our party for a long time the importance of having a truly democratic parliament where all members of parliament are elected. Wouldn't it make a lot of sense, given that we can't abolish the Senate, for the next Prime Minister to make it his mission to make the Senate an elected chamber? Wouldn't that help open up the democratic process, make Parliament a lot more respectable for people?
Well, we certainly disagree there. We believe the unelected Senate should be abolished. It's a group of people who end up being lobbyists.
But the Prime Minister can't abolish.
Well, but we should be taking the steps required in order to abolish that institution.
That would be
Here, let me get on to the question of leadership,
amendment.
Mr. Harper.
Yeah.
And that is this whole question of whether or not you're willing to take action or you want to hide behind free votes on fundamental questions. This is a basic governance question. Are you going to stand by if a free vote in Parliament takes away a woman's right to choose? Are you going to stand by if the rights of same-sex couples, lesbians and gays, are put into the back of the bus and do absolutely nothing, hiding behind a free vote? Or are you willing to take a position? I find this hiding behind free votes to be quite shocking from somebody hoping to lead in this country people want to know answers.
Be very clear on the positions I've taken on that. I want there to be no misunderstanding. I've said repeatedly, my Conservative government will not be tabling any legislation impacting in any way a woman's right to choose. Likewise, I fully support the equality of gay men and lesbians in Canadian society. I think the place we disagree is on the traditional definition of marriage and whether that should be respected.
But Mr. Harper, what if someone brings forward a law that actually comes before Parliament?
Well,
you always couch this by saying the government wouldn't do it. But what if somebody put forward a proposed law that said a woman's right to choose should be removed?
Well, Mr.
Would
Layton,
you
let me just
override a decision of the House? Would you take
5
some
seconds,
leadership?
Mr. Harper.
Or are you going to hide behind these free votes?
I won't be supporting that kind of legislation.
Gentlemen, we have to end that there. Mr. Harper and Mr. Martin are next. Mr. Martin.
Well, let me just simply pick up on that. The fact is that your co-leader, or co-founder, Mr. Peter MacKay, said that your unwillingness to basically guarantee minority rights is the equivalent of a nuclear bomb.
No, he
the
didn't say
fact
that.
of the fact of the matter is, I asked you yesterday, will you refuse to use the notwithstanding clause? And what you're saying to us is that you will allow fundamental rights to be determined by the whim of a political party or maybe by the leader, because you will refuse to guarantee rights that are in the Charter.
I haven't said that at all.
That, Mr. Harper, is fundamentally wrong.
Mr. Martin, what I've said is I understand the original purpose of the notwithstanding clause that Mr. Trudeau agreed to and even suggested be used on occasion, and that is that there are times, it's different than the American system. We have times where we give Parliament some discretion if it thinks the courts are terribly, terribly wrong. Let me give you an example.
You've given us an example.
Let me give you an
you
example.
Would take away a woman's right to choose.
No, I would not, Mr. Martin.
Well, the fact is that you would allow that vote to take place.
I absolutely would not.
That vote
Mr.
is
Martin, we
taken
have
place.
the same position on private members' business. We're using your system on private members'
Would you use the
business.
notwithstanding clause in the case of a woman's right to choose? Would you protect it?
I will not have legislation limiting a woman's right to choose, Mr. Martin. I've said that. But let me go to a case where I would consider the notwithstanding
Mr. Harper,
clause.
let me ask you another question. Why do you say that sexual orientation is not protected by the Charter?
Let me talk about an example. Let me talk about an example where the notwithstanding clause might be appropriate.
No.
We've had repeated decisions and acts of your government on trying to declare child pornography having artistic merit or public good, court decisions that limit our ability to stop the dissemination of child pornography. If I can't do it through ordinary legislation, I will do that if I have to protect the rights of children. But Mr. Martin, let me return to the main subject we were asked about. Because you bring forward these rights issues to avoid the critical issues of scandal. Let's go back to Mr. Duceppe's question. Mr. Martin, why didn't you find out about these things before you signed the checks?
Mr. Harper, there are two of us here. I brought forth these rights issues because these are fundamental to our democracy. In a nation of immigrants such as we are, if we're not prepared to protect minority rights, then in fact what we're doing is saying our values do not count. Mr. Harper has said that sexual orientation is not protected under the Charter. He is wrong. That means that somebody could be fired if they were gay. Mr. Harper is wrong.
We don't support
Mr.
that
Harper
at all,
would take
Mr.
away
Martin.
a woman's right to choose.
Mr. Martin,
he is wrong.
You keep throwing.
Mr.
is
Harper
just your
refuses to
campaign
recognize
of fear
the future
and falsehood
of this country
to
lies
cover up
in
for
a
your
strong
Gentlemen, we have to
record
end it
of
there.
scandal and mismanagement.
Gentlemen, we have to stop it there. Mr. Duceppe and Mr. Layton are next. Mr. Duceppe.
Well, when we're talking about credibility or confidence of the population towards the politicians, we're talking also about leadership. And leadership for a leader of a party is to say what his party thinks on certain issue, major issue. You said that you were against the Clarity Bill, C-20. And the day you said that, Madame McDonough, the former leader of your party in Halifax, said she disagreed with you. Bill Blakey, your House leader in Winnipeg, said he fully disagrees with you, that he's fully supporting Bill C-20. So I'd like to know, what's the position of the NDP on C-20? Is it Jack Layton's stand, or is it Alexa McDonough and Bill Blakey stands? I'd like to know, because at least we can say there's some confusion with your party on that question.
Well, people know exactly what I think about it, and I've spoken my mind on it. But you know something? It's time for us to get beyond these old obstacles and debates of the past. This is where Canada wants to go. This is where Quebec wants to go, is towards a positive future. And what we're proposing, and what I said also in my answer, which was very clear, is that it's time for us to build a Canada with a hopefulness and a working together that allows Quebecers, the nation, the people of Quebec, to be fully a part of Canada. I know this isn't your agenda, Mr. Duceppe. That's clear. That's fine.
Let me reply
but we
to
are
that.
a federalist party that believes in having a strong place for Quebec
But
and
when
a
you
federalism
come-
that works. And
when
when
you
I
come-
met with Madame Morel to help to
Louise is a
implement the
great friend of
housing
mine.
program, I'm sorry, when we worked together to bring forward the housing program and try to convince Mr. Martin that he should move ahead with something, we
Mr.
haven't
Duceppe,
much housing
Mr.
bill.
Duceppe, let him
But
reply,
this is
please.
where some
May I
action
reply?
is
Just to
needed.
tell you that Louise Arel is a great friend of mine, and she's
Indeed.
supporting the bloc. But you're saying that's a debate of the past, but when you came in Quebec a few weeks ago, it was so important for you to make a good impression in Quebec that you told Quebecers, well, I'm very different than the Liberal, I'm very different than Stéphane Dion, so that's why I'm against Bill C-20. You can count on Jack Layton not to use that bill. I'll try to make sure that that bill won't exist anymore. At that time, a few weeks ago, was damn important, but tonight we're in the English debate. It's not so much
not
important.
At all, Mr. Duceppe.
I'd like to know
and look,
your exact stand on that.
I was born in Quebec.
Are you saying the same
I grew
thing?
up in Quebec,
I don't
and my
want to know
goal
where
is
you
to
were
keep
born.
Quebec
I want to know
strong
if you
in
agree
this
with
country.
Alex
My
McDonough
thoughts
and
are
Bill
well
Blakey.
known on the subject.
You refuse to answer
We
the question.
believe in building
okay,
a
I know that
federalist
your party
Canada,
has no
a positive
position on that.
Gentlemen, time is up. Gentlemen, time is up.
You're not leading the party.
Mr. Martin and Mr. Layton are next. Mr. Martin.
Well, I must say, Mr. Layton, that I do not believe that the Clarity Act should be repealed. I believe that it's there, and I don't think that we should be reopening any of these old wounds. But I must say that I do believe that in terms of issues like proportional representation, that I think that given the amount of provincial experimentation that's going on, there's an enormous opportunity for us, in order to improve our democracy, to look at what some of the provinces are doing and learn about them. Now, as you do know, we do have an independent ethics commissioner. He's somebody who's just been appointed. He went through a parliamentary committee, and he is an outstanding Canadian. So I think that we are making substantial ground, and I just think we want to continue to do that.
Well, Mr. Martin, I heard an interview of yours where you put down proportional representation, saying it created minority governments. That's kind of interesting today. But, you know, I've got to take issue with a claim you're making, that there's only two parties in this country that are going to have the possibility of governing. What kind of arrogance gives you that kind of proposition? You're taking for granted the Canadian people. There are two parties in this election that can stop the Stephen Harper agenda of reckless tax cuts, getting in with George Bush on his missile defense, and taking action for social policies. There's two. It's not only your party. And in fact, Canadians are giving up on your party. Broken promises, scandals, you're talking to George Bush about Star Wars 2, and massive cutbacks that have left our healthcare, education, and environment in tatters. And I object to the fact that you're not willing to allow the Canadian people to decide. You've pre-decided. They don't want to reward you with a fourth turn at bat, Mr. Martin.
Well, I think I'll accept that criticism, Mr. Layton, and I'll also accept the ongoing point that you made about the fact that Mr. Harper's views are really not the views of mainline Canadians. And in fact, one has to wonder when Peter MacKay, in fact, takes issue with his leader, just where Mr. Harper is leading the Conservative Party. It's clear that this was an alliance takeover. It is clear that with the number of Conservatives who are leaving the party, the fact that they dropped the word progressive from their name,
but
that
why
they
would
no
they
longer
select
represent
you, Mr. Martin, and the Liberals as the replacement after 3 turns at bat, filled with scandals? That's all we've been reading about in the papers. Massive cutbacks, leaving waiting lists as long as imaginable, and now you're promising to solve them when you cause them. Smog, water, homelessness.
I think what we should
every
do, Mr.
problem
Layton,
we're
is
facing,
take a look at the basic issue.
You should hold yourself to account on this,
whether
Mr.
it is
Martin.
Kyoto, whether
it's
it is
just not acceptable.
No,
there is
Kyoto,
another choice. Will you grant that?
Oh, I'd love to, but you
Gentlemen, your time is
out.
up. Mr. Duceppe and Mr. Harper are next. Mr. Duceppe.
Yes, talking about credibility, Mr. Harper, you're a spokesman about bilingualism, Mr. Reid, I think. He was, I don't know if he still, has said that he was questioning the services given to the French minorities in the federal institutions concerning the law on official languages. I'd like to know the exact position of your party on that. Will the French minorities will receive the same services and even better services, because they deserve to receive better services than the one they're receiving right now? So I'd like to know where you stand on that.
Well, Mr. Duceppe, we've been very clear. We intend no changes to official language policy. We certainly support all of the principles of that party. Mr. Reid is quite knowledgeable on this, made some suggestions for what I thought were administrative changes, but those need to be debated before they are accepted as any kind of party policy, because our party policy in this election is that we want to keep the basic fundamentals of this policy.
Does that mean that you're ready to question and to revisit those services and question the fact that they may be reduced? Is it one of these scenarios?
I plan no reductions in these services at all, Mr. Duceppe. But you know, we have a committee. We have an official language commissioner. We have the committees on Parliament Hill that are constantly studying these questions
example,
and suggesting administrative changes. But Mr. Duceppe, isn't this a bit rich coming from you? Do you who want to take the heartland, the French heartland of this country, out of the country, who have never stood up for English language services in the province of Quebec. Isn't this a bit rich coming
Mr.
from
Harper,
you?
Mr. Harper, René Lévesque back in the 80s offered reciprocity for the French minorities compared to the services received by the Anglo-Quebecers. My mother's name Rollet, you know that? And the Anglo-Quebecers, Jack Layton can tell you that, they have their own hospitals, their own schools, their own universities, their own theaters. It'd be just paradise for the French minorities outside Quebec to receive the same kind
increasingly
of
in the rest of the country. But how are the French communities who have been shrinking under this Liberal government for 30 years, how do they benefit from your plan to pull Quebec out of this country?
But are you telling me that they don't deserve to receive services because they do exist? No. It's not because Quebec is there. Even if Quebec is not there, you should respect
the heartland
French
of the
minorities
French language in this
outside
country.
Quebec.
Gentlemen, we have to end there. Our time is up, but now the opportunity to mix it up a bit with a debate among all of you. Keith Bogue has a question, and Mr. Martin will start the debate.
The issue of trust and credibility is not just an issue from the past, but it will be an issue going forward as well. And your parties have put forward very different views of what the economy is going to be like. Starting from the same assumptions, you've wound up with very different, wildly different estimates of what revenues will be over 5 years, of what expenditures will be over 5 years. How are Canadians supposed to decide whom to believe? And what if you're all wrong? What happens then? What are your core priorities? What promises will you get rid of right away?
Well, there's no doubt that our number one priority is health care. And it is reducing waiting times. And that is essential if, in fact, your children or my children are going to get the kind of health care that they require. And that is what's so fundamentally different between Mr. Harper's program and our own. The fact is that we both have roughly the same revenue projections. The difference arises in the spending. The fact is that there is a $50 billion black hole. Mr. Harper has said he is going to cut taxes, he's going to increase military spending, and he is going to find $50 billion. He would have to find close to $9 billion this year alone if he's going to accomplish his program.
But, Mr. Martin, your past is exactly like Stephen Harper's projected future. You were the one who brought in the biggest tax cut in history. You were the one that precipitated the huge cuts that people are now grappling with, some of which you've come in on a horse in order to try and solve. It's quite convenient. Canadians are upset about this, and this is why they don't see you as the alternative to replace Mr. Harper and his reckless tax cuts, because you've already delivered. And may I add one other thing? The biggest priority in your proposal is debt reduction, even bigger than health care, if you look at your own numbers.
Let me just comment for a minute on our own numbers. And our own numbers, our plan has been looked at by many reputable economists and Canadians, the C.D. Howe Institute, Merrill Lynch, Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the Bank of Montreal, Global Insight, and they all say these are doable because we have a different approach than Mr. Martin. That approach is, yes, to put some priority on health care and on national defense, but modest growth of the government otherwise, not the kinds of rates of growth we've seen over the past several years, the double and triple in every department, the size of the economy, resulting in record waste, mismanagement, and corruption. And Mr. Martin, you say you know the numbers. Well, if you knew the numbers, why didn't you do something about the gun registry when it was spinning out of control? What did you know about the employment insurance surplus? And where is the sponsorship money, if you know the numbers,
Harper has
Mr. Martin?
asked me a couple of questions. Perhaps I should answer them. The first thing is that the Chamber
we'd
of
all
Commerce,
like to know.
The Chamber of Commerce basically said, Nancy used Anthony, said she didn't know where you were coming from in your projections.
No, that's not true.
And I, by the way, have gone through all of the bank economists today to ask them to look at what they have said publicly about Mr. Harper's projections, and they all said he was going to have to bring in very steep spending cuts.
No, spending control is what they said. We have to control spending, which you're unable to do.
The fact is, your numbers don't add up. It's a common sense.
How can you talk about the numbers with your record of disappearing billions?
7 straight
You've misjudged the budget, the surplus, by billions of dollars every year. Speak about the numbers. Where is the sponsorship money? Tell us about some numbers. Where is it?
Mr. Harper, why don't you admit the fact that most economists have said you can't find that sort of spending cuts?
They haven't said that at all.
We're
spending less than you're doing.
Mr. Duceppe has not had a chance. Mr. Duceppe, let's get you into this conversation.
I'd like to say that the state has a role to play in the economy, not to replace private companies, of course, but certainly to support in certain sectors. I think it's the role of the state to redistribute the money, make sure also that there's not a too great difference between different regions of Canada. So I was surprised yesterday when I heard that the federal government is ready to give $500 million to GM in Oshawa. I'm happy for the workers in Oshawa. But I don't understand why a few months ago, a few years, you refused to give money to GM in Boisbriand in Quebec. And you even said that the Picus government was irresponsible when he said he was to give $300 million. You said we should not give a penny. But when comes time to help in Oshawa, then you're ready. Could you explain that?
It's an election. It's an election,
Mr.
Mr.
question
Duceppe.
about what our priorities would be. And I think it's a fair question.
Why don't
and
we
we've
let
seen
Mr.
Mr. Martin, of course, breaking promises for year after year. What are we proposing to do? Well, we're proposing a balanced budget each and every year, not with big debt repayments, as Mr. Martin is so focused on, including in his big economic speech in Montreal. That's not the way we should go now if we're going to reinvest in our country. We need to have a green and prosperous investment strategy, focusing on green cars, focusing on cities, public transportation, affordable housing. That creates jobs, and it can be done in a balanced budget context, as well as reducing the GST for families on family essentials and reducing taxes for people with $15,000 or below incomes.
Debt repayment essentially says that this generation is not going to ask our children to pay for us. So I think debt repayment is a very, very good thing.
But then you've put it on the backs of students. Students have double the debt now because of your action.
The fact is,
the nation has less debt, but the students have more. How is that a reasonable or fair system?
Gentlemen, we can't hear anything. I'll let Mr. Martin continue.
The fact is, Mr. Harper, that you cannot cut taxes, increase spending massively, and stay in the black. It is a
First of all,
it's an
Mr. Martin, let me review. Let me review our program. We are planning modest tax reductions of less than 10% of federal revenue.
Why aren't you prepared
and
to
investment into some key areas. What we're not planning to do, Mr. Martin, as I said, is what you do, which is grow the size of the government in every single department at twice the rate of the economy. It's not necessary to do this. There has to be some spending control as well, whether we have a surplus or not.
Now, let me answer where we're going to grow it. We're growing at 8% in health care. Think about that. That's
where we're
8%
spending
in health
as
care, 3.5% in old age pensions is where it's going to be going up, 5% in the transfers to the provinces. That money has to go up. So where is Mr. Harper going to find his $50 billion?
Mr. Martin, those are
You're still spending on the gun registry.
You're
still spending on the gun registry.
$50 billion.
You're still sending money to major corporations.
Promises at this stage, really.
Mr. Martin,
you can stand back, but it's the truth. Tell us about the promises that you've broken, like the child care promise, the health care investment promise, the promise for pharmacare in 1997.
Now
the list is so long, I haven't got an arm long enough, Mr.
because,
Martin.
in fact, we've increased health care spending by $50 billion.
After
we're bringing in a child care program. The fact is, we're going to bring in a pharmacare program. It's all there. The real problem is, we're not saying we're going to cut taxes immediately. We're not going to do a Mike Harris. That is what Mr. Harper is saying he's going to do.
Your level of spending and everything, you'll have to raise taxes. At least Mr. Layton.
That's the problem.
May I have an answer? Why is that such a difference between Oshawa and Boisbriand?
Take a look at the amount of money that we have put in the aeronautic industry in Montreal.
I'm talking about the automobile industry.
The fact is,
why is it such a difference between Oshawa and Boisbriand?
Are you interested in the question? Are you interested in the answer?
What's the difference between Oshawa and Boisbriand?
What we have done is to put money into into those areas that are strongest in each area. We will support.
Gentlemen, we have to end it there. The time is up. We will move on to our second segment, and the theme for the second segment is Canada's place in the world. Keith Bogue has a question which you will each get an opportunity to answer.
Canada-U.S. relations has typically been a difficult issue for government to manage, and some people might argue that recently Canada-U.S. relations have deteriorated. What would you do to improve Canada-U.S. relations?
Mr. Duceppe, you are first in this round.
Well, I think we have to have the greatest respect for the American people, which was not the case with some declarations made by some Liberal members. After September the 11th, I think we have a very important interpretation of what's happening around the world, us and the United States. They went in Iraq, we were opposed to that. And we strongly opposed the war in Iraq. Paul Martin's team at that time was against Jean Chrétien's team, not certain of going or not going into Iraq. I think we have to have very clean relations with Americans, very clear relations, and tell them what we think freely, and also fight for our industries like the softwood lumber. The problem over there, they're supporting their industry, we're not. I think having a friend doesn't mean you're kneeling in front of him.
Mr. Duceppe, thank you. Mr. Layton.
Well, the American people are our closest friends. They're our neighbors in every respect. And when I went to Congress to meet with congressional leaders, they told me, we don't hear enough from Canada about the kinds of issues that you want to see pursued. Become more engaged. Stand up for yourselves on softwood lumber, on steel, on BSE, on all of these various issues. And the second thing they told me was this: you Canadians, stand firm. These were people who were opposing the Star Wars missile defense, members of Congress. These were people who appreciated our Medicare system and didn't want to see it privatized because they used it as an example of the way they'd like to move in the United States. Let's form relationships and work with those people to see if we can't build a better North America and a better world.
Thank you, Mr. Layton. Mr. Harper.
Well, thank you very much. We all realize we have problems from time to time with the United States, and being such a huge country, those problems are often threatening, but the reality is the United States remains our closest neighbor, our best ally, and our biggest customer by far. I believe what we have to do, occasionally governments will disagree. This government disagreed with the Americans in Iraq. I did not disagree with them, but we've got to be able to disagree without being disagreeable, and that's what this government did, and I thought it has made a number of our trade problems worse. I think what we have to do in the long term, the United States has a lot of interest in increasing integration in security and defense areas. I think we have to insist equally on better protection for our industries through more integration of our services and industries into the United States economy.
Mr. Martin.
Well, I have largely reestablished our relationships with the United States, but I don't believe that you have to do that by going on bended knee. If you listen to what Mr. Harper did, the fact is that Mr. Harper wrote a letter to the Wall Street Journal. And what he said in that letter effectively was he apologized. He apologized because we were not going into the war, the forces of the coalition in the war against Iraq. Now, I simply ask you, Mr. Harper is entitled to his opinion, but to go to the United States and apologize and then do it in a foreign newspaper in the United States, the Wall Street Journal, I can tell you that is not the way that you earn respect. And you said that Canadians were wrong. Well, let me tell you, Mr. Harper, Canadians were not wrong. You were wrong.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. We're now going to begin the one-on-one debates of this segment with a follow-up question from Craig Oliver.
Well, Mr. Duceppe, our American friends have often complained that we're not pulling our weight, that our defense spending is far below what it should be. At least two of the men up there with you are proposing significant, in one case, massive increases in defense spending. Do you agree that this is what we should be doing? Do you agree that it is the priority we should be following? And to what end?
Mr. Duceppe and Mr. Harper will be the first two debaters. Mr. Duceppe.
I think it's a good question. I want to ask Mr. Harper, you know as well as me that next fall we're supposed to revisit the foreign policies of Canada, discussing what kind of orientation Canada will take in foreign affairs. And consequently, I think, we should then define what kind of national defense we want. I mean, you have to define the national defense after you define your foreign policies. Otherwise, I mean, doing one thing before the other, and I don't think it's very logical to do that. So it is surprising for me, and also with the Liberals, to see that you're ready to spend a lot of money in national defense without before defining foreign policies. Don't you think we should wait and define foreign policies and then define the national defense policy and choose what kind of arms we need? If we go for a mission of peace, we won't have the same type of arms than if we want to accompany the Americans in Iraq. It's quite a difference.
I think you make a useful point, but my view is a little bit different. I think we live in a world that's troubled and in a lot of fluctuation, post-Cold War, post-9/11. My belief is that a sovereign country, and I'm interested in a sovereign Canada.
Me too.
A sovereign, well, maybe not a sovereign Canada, but a sovereign country has to have a range of capabilities. The kinds of monies we're talking about investing, and I admit they look big, but frankly, after we invest them, we will still have one of the smallest militaries relatively in NATO. That's because of decades of cuts and disintegration of equipment. We're making sure that this country has a range of capabilities. We had a debate over Iraq, but what really mattered in Iraq in the end was we were not in any coalition for or against. Nobody really cared because we had so little to contribute to these kinds of debates. I want to make sure whether we go to these things or don't go, that our voice is meaningful, and I think, frankly, having a range of capabilities is important in this world.
I'm not discussing the amount of money.
Yeah.
I'm just discussing the fact that I don't find it very logical to decide what kind of arms we need before we've been deciding what kind of national defense policy we'll have. And to do that, we have to decide what kind of foreign policy Canada will adapt.
I've spoken about the kind of foreign policy I think we need, and first and foremost,
yes, but
it
Parliament
involves
will decide that
protecting Canadian sovereignty.
Why don't we wait for that before
Well, I've talked about it already,
decisions?
protecting Canadian sovereignty, and that means having a range of capacities that we can contribute to this world.
Gentlemen, we're out of time. Mr. Layton and Mr. Martin are next. Mr. Layton.
Well, I think what we have to do, first of all, Mr. Martin, is talk about Star Wars and about missile defense, because you were rather silent on Iraq at the time. You're speaking about it now. But when you were running for leader of the Liberal Party, we didn't hear much. In fact, you appointed Mr. Pratt, who was one of the ones who advocated we go in, as your defense minister. And before you know it, we were off discussing missile defense with George Bush, Star Wars. And in fact, you tried to claim at the time it didn't involve weapons in space, and you protest that you don't want to see weapons in space. So I went to the U.S. and met with the members of Congress who are debating this themselves. They showed me the budgets. We're talking about over 300 weapons in space in the initial period. How could you have taken us down that road of George Bush's policies? I mean, it's interesting to see your ads attacking Mr. Harper. We know where he stands. He wants us thoroughly engaged in George Bush's agenda.
Well,
But you've taken us down that road,
fine.
Mr. Martin.
The fact is that, of course, the missile defense system is not Star Wars. It is very clear the technology is not there. And we have made it very clear that we will not be a part of the weaponization of space. So whatever discussions may be taking place, if they involve the weaponization of space, we will not be there, and we will fight against the weaponization of space.
But even your own former External Affairs Minister, Lloyd Axworthy, excuse me.
No,
he is contradicting you on this.
Excuse me.
Mr. Martin,
well,
he's contradicting you.
Right now, I have made that very clear. We will not be part of it if it is the weaponization of space. So you can create straw men all you want, Mr. Layton, but the fact is that we're not going to be there.
Did you ask Mr. Bush about this when you met with him? Did you tell him that we wouldn't support weapons in space? Because all members of Congress I've met with showed me the documents, Mr. Martin. You're taking us down a very dangerous course here that Canadians don't support.
You talk a great deal, but you don't listen very much.
Well, so do you, sir.
So let me simply say
you're talking with George Bush, and that's the problem
on
this issue.
When I met with President Bush, I said that we would not be part of the weaponization of space, that we would not be part of ballistic missile defense if it in any way, shape, or form involved the weaponization of space. I have said that privately, and I have said that publicly, and I've said it in Canada, and I have said it in Washington.
Why don't we withdraw from the talks? Why don't we withdraw from those talks now?
NORAD is very
and make
important
it clear
to us, and we're going to continue. But we must have an independent foreign policy. When you take a look at what's going on in Afghanistan and in Haiti, our ability to build institutions
Star Wars
and
removes
to
our
take
independence,
Canadian
Mr.
values and
it
to
removes
export
it
them
and makes
to
the
build
world a more
strong
Gentlemen,
dangerous
we
place.
have to leave it there. Mr. Duceppe and Mr. Layton are next. Mr. Duceppe.
Yes, Mr. Layton, I think that we have the same stand on the Army defining foreign affairs policies first, then a national defense policy, and then finally what kind of arms we need. I think you think the same thing than me on that.
Very similar, although I would say that we are embarrassed, frankly, with some of the equipment that our armed service personnel are having to deal with now, and that's why we supported the investment for the Sea Kings, and we've put in our budget an additional sum every single year to address those issues.
I do agree with you on that. But I'd like to address another issue. We're discussing this security perimeter in North America. There is negotiations between Canada and United States on one side, and on the other side between Mexico and United States. I've met with ministers of the Mexican governments, and I think we should have negotiations involving the three countries. At least having an observer to the Mexican-American negotiation from Canada, and having a Mexican observer to the negotiations between Canada and United States. Where do you stand on that?
Well, these discussions are important discussions to have. It's an interesting suggestion. But, a fundamental concern while we deal with the security issues that emerged is also to ensure that human rights are protected. And
Absolutely.
This, of course, has come to the fore with the case of Mahar Arar, and we're very pleased to have Muni Mazig running as a candidate for us to underline the importance of those issues and many others, as a very strong Muslim woman with a lot of knowledge of the issues. But the whole issue of perimeter security also needs to be addressed in the context of how we work with our U.S. friends. And for example, we see right now many problems at the border. we have huge lineups at the border as a result of racial stereotyping, as a result of slowdowns, and it's hurting our economy. So while we pursue security, as our members there, Joe Comartin, Brian Massey, have emphasized, we've got to get the infrastructure in place to make the trade work, and that's got to be a part of our discussions.
Well, what could I say? I mean, I think we're on the same side on that issue. The fact is, I think that we have to put the pressure enough on the government. I don't know which party will have that government, and to make sure that the foreign policy will be decided before.
They both think that they've earned the right to be the government.
Canada,
we don't.
Buys new arms.
Gentlemen, thank you. Mr. Martin and Mr. Harper are next. Mr. Martin.
In terms of our defense policy, it really has got to be one that reflects the post-9/11 world. The Cold War is over. We are not interested in building aircraft carriers. We are not interested in spending all kinds of money on essentially a defense policy based on a foreign policy that has been done outdated. What we are very interested in is building the kind of defense policy that will support peacemaking and peacekeepers. When we went into Haiti, when we went into Afghanistan to do institution building, you have to have soldiers who are able to support and provide that kind of security. That's really what the modern defense policy is going to be all about. And I raised this with the G8. This is a incredibly significant role that Canada can play in the future, helping weak countries become strong democracies. And you need peacemaking and peacekeeping forces to do that. And so that's where our military ought to be directed, not the kinds of invasion forces that Mr. Harper is talking about.
Let me talk about that. We didn't propose an aircraft carrier. We specifically have proposed hybrid carriers. These are not carriers to take conventional fighter jets. They're carriers to carry peacekeepers. They're carriers that would carry helicopters. The helicopters you've promised the military for the past 11 years. Helicopters, in some cases, are nearly 50 years old. We are admitting to the Canadian people we have to make these investments or our military would crumble. Why will anybody believe you, Mr. Martin, when once again you recycle for the fourth time, whether it's in social policy or economic policy or in defense policy, the same old promises you've never fulfilled?
Now, just take a look. There you go. You want aircraft carriers. If you talk to anybody in the peacemaking world, what they'll tell you they need in Haiti, they need medical carriers. They need ships that are going to provide medical services to their own troops and to the local populations. What they need are supply ships.
Mr. Martin, when we went to Afghanistan, you couldn't even take our troops. We had to had to hitch a ride with the United States to get our equipment and men over to that war. Is that what a sovereign country does?
Those aren't done in ships. Those are done in very large aircraft, large carriers. Once again, you're about 20 years out of date. We're looking ahead. If you want quick mobility, you use aircraft.
Let me ask you one other question, Mr. Martin. You talked about being opposed to the war in Iraq. That was a position Mr. Chrétien and you apparently took, at least Mr. Chrétien did. I never understood yours. But why did Canada have troops in Iraq if you weren't going to support them?
They were on exchange. They had been on exchange earlier.
As Prime Minister, my troops will be under our own
Gentlemen, we
flag.
have to end it there. Mr. Duceppe and Mr. Martin are next. Mr. Duceppe.
Yes, Mr. Martin, you said you didn't make a decision on the anti-missile shield. Let's say I believe you. But there's one decision you have to make before the end of June, and it says to decide whether NORAD will be entitled to manage that anti-missile shield. And that is certainly opening a door if you entitle NORAD to do so. So I think the Canadian population and the Quebec population deserve to know tonight whether you will transform NORAD to make NORAD entitled to manage the anti-missile. You have to give an answer tonight, because I've asked you that question quite a few times in the House.
Well, I'll answer.
Answer. That's good.
I'll answer. The fact is that whatever decision we take on NORAD, if we decide we're going to basically strengthen NORAD, that does not mean that we do anti-missile. It simply means that we're going to strengthen NORAD, and the fact is that we will strengthen NORAD.
What do you mean by strengthening NORAD?
Now, let me ask you a question, Mr. Duceppe.
But what do you mean?
Do you not think that when we're looking, you say that we shouldn't be making any decisions about defense forces, but when you look at the role that we're going to be playing in Haiti, as an example, something that you and I both have a personal involvement in, is surely to heaven we should be having the kinds of forces who can go to Haiti, who can sit down there and reestablish security for people so that we can go in and build schools and build hospitals. That is the Canadian foreign policy role.
I'll answer.
We have the capacity of building the institutions of democracy around the world, and we shouldn't give up on it. And surely to heaven, Mr. Duceppe, you're not going to say, well, wait, don't go into Haiti.
Mr.
I didn't say that at all. I just said that it'd be stupid to buy new arms without deciding what kind of national defense we want. And we can't decide what kind of national defense we want before deciding what kind of foreign policy we want. So I never said that we shouldn't put money to help in Haiti. I never said that. But I want to know, you said you want to strengthen NORAD. What do you mean by strengthening NORAD? Does that mean that you'll tell that NORAD will be able and entitled to manage the anti-missile shield?
Now
this is a very clear question.
What NORAD is essentially the body to which Canada belongs that enables us to protect all of North America. And if we were not in NORAD, what that would mean is the Americans would be doing this despite us. And it's very, very important for Canada's defense.
Are you opening the door
to
that
kind of control with NORAD, so
again,
that in
you're
fact,
not answering
Canadian can make
Gentlemen,
Canadian
we have to end that there. Gentlemen, Mr. Harper and Mr. Layton. Our next, Mr. Harper.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Layton, I often find a strange sympathy with you. I know we seldom disagree on issues, but we at least usually can figure out what each other are talking about. I know during the war in Iraq we had very different positions. I felt if we had troops there, we should support them, and you felt, and your party felt, that if we weren't going to be in the war in Iraq, let's take our people out and not subject them to danger. And these are the kinds of things I know drive us crazy about Mr. Martin and his constant gyrations across these kinds of issues. But on another issue, I'm not sure you are quite as frank with the Canadian people. We know you're against the anti-ballistic missile shield and against any discussion of extending NORAD or being part of that initiative. But Mr. Layton, the truth is that your reluctance about our relationship with the United States goes far, far deeper than that. Your party has never supported NATO. It has never supported NORAD. It has never supported NAFTA. And the truth is we would have no relation with the United States if your party had its way.
We do call for a re-examination of that free trade agreement, which is giving corporations, huge multinationals, the power to sue the Canadian government when democratic decisions are made. And it has hurt a great many industries and does need to be reopened and examined. We have said it needs to be transformed.
Would you cancel it?
Of Canadian sovereignty.
Would you cancel it?
We've said what we want to do is have it wide open and throw out the sections that are allowing corporations to have more powers than our elected democracies. And
I want to get far greater job security for our industries and security in the United States, but I won't rip up NAFTA. Would you rip it up
if you don't get those things? What you're trying to do is bring us so close to the U.S. I mean, one wonders if we're going to become a 51st state by all definitions. We're going to be in Star Wars, according to you. We can't move fast enough. We are very interested in further integration. We hear all kinds. This is the hidden agenda that people worry about.
It's not hidden,
now, the
Mr. Martin.
difference between you is at least you talk about some of these issues, but the Martin government, the Liberals, said they would take us out of NAFTA and didn't.
I agree with you on that. At least you're honest. You want to be out of NAFTA.
I mean,
we have farmers, forestry work, all kinds of industries depend on NAFTA, and we have elements of our society who need better, tighter security on that agreement. That's what I want to seek. I don't want to be more distant in our economic relationship. We have got to secure all of our economic relations with the United States.
Look what's happened to our
industries.
It's
critical
to
the kinds of
We've
ordinary
got farm
people
subsidies.
you talk about.
We've got the steel judgments. We've got the softwood
Those
judgments.
things were
George
worse
Bush
before.
is ignoring them, and we've got to stand up
Gentlemen,
for Canada. Let's
we have
get
to
some
end it
backbone
there.
here.
Gentlemen, we're going to go to a wider debate that includes all of you now. David Viano has a question, and Mr. Duceppe will begin.
Well, as we've heard, whenever we talk about foreign affairs, Iraq becomes one of the dominant topics, and we've talked about the past. Let's look forward to the future. In the next few days, we're going to enter a critical phase, the turnover of power. The UN is now involved, and it's offering some approval. So I'm wondering, should Canada play a role in the reconstruction of Iraq? I mean, your opinions on that, and if so, should we really be sending our people there, given the violence on the ground that is taking place, to make them literally targets in that reconstruction?
I think we have to be very careful on that. At the same time, we have to participate with United Nations. Nothing outside United Nations. What kind of help could be done? I think there's different kind of help that could be done. And not necessarily with the Army. It could be with non-governmental groups or communities involved in helping, especially peace mission. I know the situation is just awful. But I think that being under United Nations be better than being under the Star-Spangled Banner. That I'm sure of.
There is
I have a question for Mr. Martin and Mr. Harper, if I may, picking up on this whole issue of Iraq, because both Mr. Martin and Mr. Harper repeated George Bush's contention that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Will you now at least indicate that you were wrong in the case, and how it was that you found you could make such statements at that time, which have turned out really to be unjustified?
Well, first of all, let me answer that. Mr. Martin recently speculated terrorists had got their hands on the weapons of mass destruction. I doubt that. I suspect there are some we haven't seen, but I'll accept the major governments of the world have revisited their position on whether there were or were not weapons of mass destruction, and I think we have to accept that judgment. I had come to a conclusion independently, Mr. Layton, that regardless of how advanced Iraq was, that it was inevitable that the Allies were going to remove Saddam Hussein and had to. And I'm glad to see now the entire United Nations is going to support a new regime, not put the old one of Saddam Hussein in place. There's three things we can do in Iraq. We have all along, as you know, had a limited military commitment. I think we should continue that. We also have a role to play in reconstruction and a role to play in the maintenance of civil order. These are all things, and humanitarian order, these are all things we should do. But it is a dangerous place, and we can't deny that.
The fact is that there's no doubt that terrorists have gotten a hold of a large degree of weaponry. The shoulder missiles, which are by far the most dangerous. I never said there was weapons of mass destruction, but I did say.
Maybe you made an error, but I've heard you on that.
Mr. Duceppe,
I've heard you on that.
Please, Mr. Duceppe. What I did say is that there's a wide range of weaponry that is very, very dangerous. The kinds of missiles that are capable of bringing down planes that are in the hands of terrorists. Iraq was a massive weapons factory. Now, the fact is that what we can really do is the kinds of things that we're doing in Jordan right now, which is to train police forces. What we can do when in fact, the new government takes place and stability and security is there, is we can go in terms of institution building. We've already been asked, along with the Italians, to take a look at how they can set up a new justice system. The federal state, which is what we're experts at in Canada, is very applicable to a country like Iraq with Sunni, Shia, and Kurd. There are enormous areas where this country can play a role, and now we've got a significant area of significance.
Well,
what we should do is play in exactly that area. That is the kind of thing that Canada can do. It makes no sense for us to be sending invasion troops in.
We want to get closer to George Bush through missile defense. How's the rest of the world going to see us
But the question,
Mr. Layton,
is
and what that is going to do is make it more difficult for us to work within the context of the UN that has condemned missile defense that you have begun to discuss with Mr. Bush.
Did your handlers tell you to talk all the time?
Oh, that's very funny, Mr. Martin. We're talking here about missiles that could threaten the safety of the world.
What we're talking about
I don't find it a laughing matter. I'm sorry, sir.
We're talking about
you never asked the Canadian people whether you were going to get into discussions with George Bush on putting weapons in North America that could be infinitely dangerous. And I'm asking you to hold yourself to account. What is the difference between your Star Wars, your missile defense, and Stephen Harper's? At least he comes out and says we should do it.
I've said to George Bush, and I say to the Canadian people, we will never engage in weaponization of space. But
so
we
why
will
don't you
be
withdraw
involved.
from those talks and
we will be involved in the reconstruction of Iraq.
Mr. Martin,
a very important role to play.
You should withdraw. That's what you should do,
May
Mr.
I ask
Martin.
a question? Mr. Martin, if you didn't make a decision on that, why don't you wait before modifying NORAD to make a decision on the anti-missile before modifying NORAD? You're opening the door now, and then I know what you'll say. Since we've done that, we don't have the choice now. Wait to make a decision on the anti-missile shield,
NORAD,
and then take a decision on
NORAD is an essential part of North America's
That I know.
defense.
You told me before.
And it's very important that we be able to protect North America. No. Our responsibility as a Canadian government
not what I'm
is to be able to protect Canadian citizens.
Let me try and
that security is our #1 responsibility.
Let me try and just briefly answer
and
your
if we're
question.
not able to do that, then you've got to ask yourself, what can the Canadian government do? That's
Let's
why we're
let
part
Mr.
of NORAD.
Harper in, please.
Just briefly, we may have differences of opinion on how to proceed with this, what order it should be done in. I would just make this commitment, as we've made in our platform. If we make military commitments or we make changes to international treaties like this, we will, of course, as a government, bring this to Parliament, and Parliament will get a vote. And I think that's the time. These things should be discussed
Harper,
directly by
the Bloc
Parliament.
proposed that twice, that all those treaties be voted by the members in the House, not only decided by the government behind closed doors.
I agree.
So I'm asking you, Mr. Martin, why twice did you vote against? Did you vote against that motion proposed by the Bloc, saying that all international treaty, like Kyoto, when you needed our help to make sure Kyoto was to be adopted by the House, it was adopted by the House and submitted to the House. on treaty like NORAD and any international treaty, would you accept that the House makes the final decision and not the government behind closed doors?
The convention in Canada since Confederation, in order that Canada can negotiate treaties, is, of course, that they don't all have to go to Parliament. That's the way it's been since the very beginning.
True. We're not taking vote on that.
Shouldn't we change that?
No, I don't believe so.
You change it for Kyoto.
I don't think that we want to find ourselves in the situation where when the Canadian government goes to and signs a treaty, there's no doubt that there should be take-note debates. There should be full debates, and where possible, those treaties should be submitted to the House.
Well, the same should apply to missile defense, Mr. Martin, and you shouldn't be taking us down such a dangerous road that Canadian
Mr. Martin.
That's the British Harper system, and that's the way that our situation works.
Mr. Martin,
and so, but fundamentally, what we've got to do is have an active and independent foreign
Gentlemen,
policy.
we are out of time on this discussion. We are now going to move on to our next theme, which is social policy. David Viano has a question which each of you will have an opportunity to answer.
Well, given this is an issue that affects just about every single Canadian cities. The vast majority of Canadians live in cities. It's well documented that they're crumbling, sewers are failing, roads are bad. And Mr. Harper, in particular, I'm directing this towards you. The big city mayors, and one mayor in particular, has described your party as barbarians waiting at the gate. How is it you seem to be stick-handling around this city's issue that affects so many Canadians, so many voting Canadians?
Well, let me be very clear. Our platform has in there and has had for some time as a party, we've been in favor of transferring gas tax revenue to the municipalities through agreements with the provinces to make sure that all municipalities have access to a revenue base for the kind of infrastructure challenges that we face. It's true, I'll admit it, we haven't promised as much as Mr. Martin or some of the other parties, but Mr. Martin has made promises twice as large as I have before and not delivered on. We will deliver on the promises we make because we've made sure we costed everything year by year. But as Prime Minister of Canada, in fairness, my responsibility, to sit down with premiers and big city mayors, is not just towards big cities. It's towards big cities, suburbs, smaller urban communities, and rural Canadians. The Prime Minister has to speak for everybody and not to a small interest group.
Thank you, Mr. Harper. Mr. Layton.
Well, as some of the people watching will know, I was the president of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, which was an organization that raised this issue in the first place. And the whole point was to put the issue of our cities front and center, because we've seen a decade of disaster there, with dramatic cuts to all the fundamentals. Now, if you have a look at the Toronto Star, some of you on the web, you'll see an assessment of our relative parties' programs there. I'm proud of our party's program, because it's a real program to move forward. Mr. Harper doesn't have a program to invest in cities or communities of any size, despite his rhetoric. Mr. Martin has a record of cutting the funding to cities, and now his promises are tepid, and of course they're once again liberal promises, which means they're not worth a heck of a lot. And so I invite people to look at our positive ideas with the NDP.
Mr. Martin.
Well, the fact is, it is not only gas tax. Fundamentally, what cities require are the kinds of taxes that grow with the economy so that they can meet the growing needs that are occurring. And so this debate is evolving far beyond where Mr. Harper is. It's interesting to hear Mr. Harper say that he would like to help small rural municipalities, when in fact what he's also said is that he's going to cut regional development. He doesn't see it, which is so important to them. At the same time, he has said he wants to help cities, but he doesn't want to have any more infrastructure programs. There is a basic inconsistency in Mr. Harper's program. We are very clear how we're going to help cities. We think they should be at the national table along with the provinces to determine the major national objectives of the country, and they have to be well financed.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Mr. Duceppe.
Yes, Mr. Martin is talking about a national table with the cities and provinces. I think the Quebec government, even under a Liberal government, is very clear on that. I mean, cities are under a provincial jurisdiction, and there's not such a thing that like a national table. I think that there's a problem of stable and predictable financing for the municipalities, but first of all, there's a problem of stable and predictable financing for the provinces. So I think the federal should respect those jurisdictions, at the same time propose a new program of infrastructure. And what we're saying is that it should be not one-third, 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 but 50% by the federal government, 35% by the provinces, and 15% by the municipalities, because they don't have the same amount of money that the federal government has.
Thank you, Mr. Duceppe. Now we're going to begin the one-on-one debates on this segment with a follow-up question from Craig Oliver.
Mr. Harper, you're famous as a sort of provincial rights guy. which makes some people think there's a contradiction there for someone who wants to be the Prime Minister of Canada. But that's not the question about how much national power you might want to give away. The question is, do you believe that the federal government should use its spending power to start new programs in areas of provincial responsibility? And I'm thinking particularly of the crying need in Canada for a national child care program.
Well, Mr. Harper and Mr. Layton will begin this round. Go ahead, Mr. Harper.
Well, first of all, I do not believe starting programs in provincial jurisdiction without the support and cooperation of the provinces. And if a federal government led by me ever did that, we made a commitment to Quebec and others that we would have an opting out. On the specific issue of the child care program, I believe this is an area of provincial jurisdiction. What we have suggested in our platform is much more direct help to families. We want to phase in, as part of our tax reduction measures, a $2,000 a year per child credit for every single Canadian family, and they can spend it however they want. So this would be the kind of approach. It's a low tax rather than a high spending approach, and it's one that respects the fact that provinces have different approach to daycare in each of their jurisdictions.
So, Mr. Harper, what we've seen with governments that adopt your philosophy, and we've had the chance to have a look at it, it's not, frankly, a very pretty sight. Whether we look at the Harris government in Ontario or other governments, some of them liberal, actually, if I may say so, like the Campbell government of British Columbia, but adopting a similar approach. Very large tax cuts, and then, sorry, we have nothing left for the people who need them. So when it comes to, for example, the child care program, building on the wonderful program that's in Quebec, I think it would be generally agreed that it's one of the best, if not the best in the country, as we've proposed, to provide that sort of access to federal funding that would allow for such a program to go on. With your huge tax cuts, it's not going to be possible. We saw that with Mr. Martin's tax cuts, that it wasn't possible to do anything in the 90s on the issue. He promised child care and couldn't deliver. You're promising the same tax cuts.
Mr. Layton, the kind of governments you protest about came into power because the NDP governments that preceded them were a lot worse.
I'm sorry.
And
they're in the process or have been already thrown out, Mr.
They're all
Harper.
struggling.
People are very unhappy
they're all struggling
with what they're doing.
With fiscal imbalance. But as I said, Mr. Layton, we have a different approach. There are vigorous daycare programs in these provinces. I support them. My own children attended daycare in Alberta, so I appreciate these things. Federally, what we can do are some other things to help people.
But daycare is completely unaffordable for families right now.
We're giving modest tax. We're giving modest tax reduction.
A child.
We're giving modest tax reduction to families that earn between $35,000 and $70,000 a year. Giving money to families with children. Increasing GST tax credits. These are all things to help people on low and modest and medium incomes. And this is part of the solution.
Similar tax credits for children, but
gentlemen, we have to end it there.
As well.
Mr. Martin and Mr. Duceppe are next. Mr. Martin.
There's no doubt that not only child care, but child care involved with early learning is an idea whose time has come. And you know, one of the great things about Confederation is just as Saskatchewan pioneered in terms of health care, we can learn from other provinces. And the Quebec model is certainly one that we should follow. And I believe that, and have actually proposed that we should have a pan-Canadian system of child care. And it should be based on that model. And we've said that we'll put forth $5 billion over the next 5 years to make sure that it takes off, that at a minimum of 250,000 child care spaces. We'll do it working with the provinces, and they'll be provincially regulated. And I think that this is a tremendous thing because young families are facing such tremendous stress and strain. And the opportunity to get the care and the nurturing that these kind of child care programs will provide is exactly the kind of thing that a government should do looking ahead.
No question?
That's what I thought.
Well, I'm surprised when you're talking about that. You say Quebec's got such a good program. I do agree. But at the same time, Quebec made that program, created that program. The fiscality in Ottawa played against the Quebec program because you raised the deduction for daycare center, for how do you say that? Daycare, I think, for the parents. And the thing is, since parents in Quebec were paying less than elsewhere in Canada, they were not eligible to receive that amount of money. It cost every year, annually, $225 million that we're losing because we do have the best service in Canada. Don't you find it quite strange and absolutely absurd to have the best system and being penalized because we do have the best system.
There was a penalty that rose in the tax system, and one of the things that I have said is that we will sit down with Quebec and we'll solve it, just as we solved the parental leave problem. In fact, with Quebec, and gave Quebec the money in order to basically make their parental leave program work. What we really require in this country is an overall family policy that will enable young families to raise their children, but also to take into account that they have to take care of aged parents.
Mr.
And there has to be a fairness in all of this.
There's an agreement of principle, but no money with that agreement up to now. And it's $1 billion you owe to Quebec because of those deductions.
We have to leave it there. Mr. Harper and Mr. Martin are next. Mr. Harper.
Sure, thank you. First of all, Mr. Martin just suggested that we would end regional development. It's not true. We would not obviously funnel it towards the kinds of programs that give money directly to liberal-friendly corporations. We have a different view of how those programs should be. We wouldn't direct municipal infrastructure from Ottawa. We have a different approach. But I think Mr. Martin has to admit, when we talk about all these problems, healthcare at the provincial level, infrastructure at the municipal level, and problems that families have making ends meet, these are all a consequence of his policy of downloading, which he's been doing for years. Mr. Martin, you gave $100 million to ad firms. You gave $160 million to Canada Steamship Lines, money to Earnscliffe. Weren't those the wrong priorities? Shouldn't you just admit it?
Now, can I ask you something? First of all, on your question about regional development and infrastructure,
weren't those the wrong priorities?
The reason that the cities are so upset with you in the smaller municipalities is that they know that you've said essentially that's what you're going to cut. But I find it very interesting that in a question to dealing with childcare and families, you're unable to discuss the issue, that you have to go to regional development and infrastructure or to corporate subsidies. We're talking about the foundation as to how, in fact, young families can make do, how they can take care of their parents, aged parents, how they can deal with the fact that when both parents are in the paid workforce, the fact is they want to take care of their children.
I answered questions on my policy on that.
Well,
what about the fact that you
nil.
created these problems through your own fiscal policies? Will you bear no responsibility for it's the federal budgets of the last 10 years give us these challenges? Will you take no responsibility for those things?
Mr. Harper, you just said that you answered it with your policy. Your policy is nil. You've had nothing to say on this issue.
I just said,
today.
Mr. Martin, we're going to help every family directly through supplementing their income through child tax deductions.
You think about
regardless of income, regardless of how they raise their children.
Child tax deductions depend upon your income. So that if you're a single mother and you don't have sufficient income, then you're not going to get the deduction. You're not going to get the child
We're also going
care.
to bring in GST tax credits for people who earn less money than that,
GST
Mr. Martin.
Think about what Mr.
And sustain the child benefits for lower-income Canadians.
Just take a look at what Mr. Harper is saying. If you make money, I'll give you a tax deduction to take care of your children. If you're a single mother, or if you've got a child with special needs, then I'm not going to give you anything. Well,
I didn't say that, Mr.
That
Martin.
is not my
Didn't
country.
say that at
That's
all.
That's not the kind of country that we built in this land. We're going to take care of those people who require
what you're
the
going to do,
help.
Mr. Martin, is you're going to publish the same list
Gentlemen,
of promises
we have to
4
stop
times.
it there. Mr. Layton and Mr. Duceppe are next. Mr. Layton.
Well, first of all, I want to indicate that the child care program that we find in Quebec is truly a model for the country. And we can learn a lot from the incredible social project that has taken place in Quebec over the last number of years, also from some of their environmental leadership. But what we need to do is address the fiscal imbalance in this country. What we have is a federal government, led by Paul Martin as finance minister, that took the surpluses and instead of investing them back through the provinces in initiatives like childcare, even as he was promising childcare programs himself, what we've had now is provinces with these huge burdens on their shoulders. And this is what has to be corrected. This is why people should not accept the proposition from Mr. Martin that there is only one choice to stop Mr. Harper, who wants to head in this direction. It's the downsizing, big tax cut approach we've seen. But Mr. Martin proposes he's the only alternative. But the history that we've seen, and I think we could agree with this, Mr. Duceppe, of Mr. Martin in charge of the purse strings has left provinces and social programs in tatters.
Okay, one thing you're saying, Mr. Layton, is the fact that you're recognizing the existence of the fiscal imbalance. You supported the motion with Mr. Harper that we put forward the House. But it's one thing recognizing the fiscal imbalance. It's another thing having a way to eliminate the fiscal imbalance. And when I look at the proposals you've made concerning that, I've seen nothing. I mean, it's Nothing, let's say, like giving back the GST to the provinces. That was a suggestion made by Mr. Seguin. But in your program, you're saying the same thing than the Liberal, more generous, but the same method, which is Ottawa knows best. You'll give money under a certain number of conditions. This is not eliminating the fiscal imbalance. Eliminating the fiscal imbalance is recognizing there's different jurisdiction in Canada, and to recognize that health and education are provincial jurisdiction, and give back the money, not putting new conditions on provinces. So I don't see nothing of that in your program.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to explain. It's a concern of Quebecers for sure. And our approach is to say, look, let's have some broad national projects together across the country, and then let's have the provincial governments pursue in their own ways, subject to very, very limited approaches.
Why don't you let Quebec decide?
And let's
Gentlemen,
build
we
what
have
we
to
dream
end
of
it there.
together across the
Mr.
country.
Harper and Mr. Duceppe are next. Mr. Harper.
Well, I think Mr. Duceppe made a good point that obviously these other parties have centralizing philosophies. We, as I just said, Mr. Duceppe, we have a different approach towards one of the problems we're talking about here, obviously infrastructure, we're talking about child care, where we try and respect the jurisdiction of the provinces. And I guess the only point I would make to you, again, is I think it's in the interest of Quebecers to have a choice between corruption and separation, and in particular between a party that would isolate Quebec and a party that would centralize power. I think we need to work with Quebec and work on some of these problems together.
Well, I told you yesterday, I'm not responsible of the importance of other parties to convince Quebecers to vote for them.
Right.
I mean, you have to do that work yourself. I think that we're doing a good job, and we're not isolating Quebec at all. There have been, 8 common fronts between the opposition parties in Ottawa since quite 4 or 5 years. Each of those common fronts was organized by the Bloc Québécois. I even said to 2 Federalist leaders that it takes a sovereigntist to make 2 Federalists talk to each other. Remember that one. So we're not isolating Quebec at all. We're defending Quebec's interests. We're not for the policy of the worst because I think it's the worst of the policy. We want to collaborate on specific issue. But I deeply believe that Quebec is a nation. And we could have good links with a great nation, which is the Canadian nation.
But I guess,
I think it is very different.
Duceppe,
but telling me
that's
that,
where
democracy is certainly not disappearing. And we do exist as a nation. And there's a sovereigntist movement in Quebec.
But
there's at least, in the worst of the poll, 40%.
Mr. Duceppe.
So what those people will do if we're not there?
You can have that view, and you have that sovereignty agenda, and we all know about it. But what about Quebecers who think seriously that they actually want to stay in the country and want to have their interests protected inside the federal government? Not all the decisions that we make involve common fronts with the opposition. We've
Are you
done that,
asking
but we
me
have
not to be there?
We have to. We have to take on this government.
You'll have Liberals. This is the situation. We played in that movie before. 74 Liberals out of 75. And they created the Constitution without the approval of the National Assembly. So we know that story. That's why the Bloc is there today.
Well, Mr. Duceppe, as I say, I think Quebecers need a way to change this government.
We need a way to change the situation. And we want a country, a different country, not better,
Gentlemen,
not worse, plain different.
Thank you. Mr. Layton and Mr. Martin are next. Mr. Layton.
Well, let's talk about cities and small communities as well. Mr. Martin, we've talked about this many times before. And I guess my disappointment has been that in our conversations to talk about the need for a gas tax to be transferred to the cities, we've waited for years. These conversations have gone on for a very long time. At first you were opposed to the idea. And later, in running for the Liberal leadership, you said, yes, the gas tax will be delivered. And we all watched with great enthusiasm. And now we see disappointment because, of course, just like other promises that Liberals have made, including yourself, it turns out that the devil is in the details. And now it's going to be phased in. And we're not sure when the phasing. It'll be up to 5 cents a litre in up to 5 years. Back-end loaded, possibly. This isn't going to help a transit system that is struggling. I mean, anyone that's been inside a subway, anyone who's looked at a bus system, anyone who's dealt with roads in rural Canada and looked at the condition they're in knows that they need action from you and they need it now, and they're not delivering it.
Take a look. Look what we did in our first budget. We essentially gave the provinces, in terms of GST returns, $7 billion over the course of the next 10 years.
So you took less money from
the first
the
thing that we
cities.
did. The
That's
second
what
thing
you
that
did
we
there.
did
You took less
was that
money
we
from the cities.
accelerated the infrastructure program, which nobody had expected. And then we said we would bring in a new infrastructure program to deal with our borders, to deal with rural infrastructure. And we also said that we would complete the gas tax deal this summer. And I met with the
deal
mayors.
this summer, but when's the money?
The money will flow this year. I met with the FCM, I met with the 22 largest cities only last week. And the fact is that they gave me what was their manifesto. And I said that manifesto reflects our views. The problem, maybe you've been away from municipalities a little bit too long, but the fact is that all of the big city mayors were there, the representative of the smaller communities were there, and the fact is that we came to an agreement. And it was one, I must say, it was one, I've got to say,
now
it was
you've
the
gone
kind
too
of
far.
agreement
You're
that
putting
is going
words
to
in the
enable
mouths
us
of some
to
of the
exactly
mayors
build
who
these
have
kinds of
specifically
cities.
come out and attacked your program because they're the ones facing the needs. I spent 20 years on a municipal council. I know exactly what they're facing because we've been dealing with it for years.
Now, Mr. Layton,
and it
you
was
just
your
said that
budget that began the cuts in the first place. You canceled the affordable housing program. Growth
they gave
of
us a policy. We
Take
accepted.
some responsibility,
there was
Mr.
complete
Martin.
agreement.
What I'm offering to Canadians
you weren't
is
there, Mr.
an
Layton.
investment strategy.
Why weren't you there,
that
Mr.
will
Layton?
work.
Gentlemen,
I will be in future, Mr.
Gentlemen,
Martin.
we have to end it there, but we have time now for the open debate. Keith Bogue has a question, and Mr. Harper, you will start off this time.
Earlier in the debate, we touched briefly on the use of the constitutional override, the notwithstanding clause, in relation to the issue of abortion. I have to say that before coming on, I got more questions from viewers asking, would you pose this question to the leaders tonight, which has to do with the circumstances, if any, under which you would use the notwithstanding clause, and is preserving a traditional definition of marriage one of those circumstances?
Well, I spoke earlier, Mr. Bogue, about the origin of the notwithstanding clause, the reason it exists, and the very, very limited circumstances under which I think it should be used. I spoke specifically of my increasing concerns about where we're going in child pornography in this country, and we have got to find a way to regulate this. If the only way to do it was a notwithstanding clause, I would do it. On the issue of the notwithstanding clause and marriage, I actually agree with Mr. Martin, who'd suggest that he's the only one who suggested to use it on that. He'd suggest we'd use it to preserve the rights of churches to perform traditional marriage. My view is that this is a authority of Parliament, and that Parliament should simply act. Parliament has never passed a statute in this. I've proposed a statute on this matter. This statute contains no notwithstanding clause. It simply asks Parliament to take a position. I obviously favor the traditional definition, but we will have a free vote of everybody in my caucus, in my cabinet, and in Parliament. And I think that's the way to deal with this problem, not put it to the courts and then threaten to use the notwithstanding clause later.
I would never use the notwithstanding clause to take away a right that had been enshrined in the Charter. I do not believe that minority rights should be subject or subservient to simply to the will of Parliament, which can be very, very short term. I believe that rights are rights, and the Supreme Court is there to protect them. And I would not use the notwithstanding clause to change the definition of marriage if it, in fact, had been determined by the Supreme Court.
But, Mr. Martin, why didn't you take some leadership here? You've been the Prime Minister now for 6 months. You could have brought to Parliament a proposal for equality on marriage for same-sex couples, but you didn't. You instead complicated the reference to the courts, hid behind it, called your election beforehand. That's not leadership. We're looking for leadership on a fundamental issue of this sort, and we haven't seen it.
And I agree with Mr. Layton on that. I think the strategy, Liberal strategy, was very clear. It was to make sure that question would be decided before the election, because a lot of the members of your caucus were against the proposal made by your own government. And the Bloc was there to support, and the NDP also, I have to say that. Otherwise, you were losing.
The reason...
Because there's not a big difference between the opinion of the Liberal members and the opinion of the Conservative members on that issue. And we've seen that during that vote. It finished with what, 137 to 132?
There is
Well,
no
actually,
but-
2 years ago,
it was
there was no
critical.
different in
Mr.
our
Galloway
positions
and
because he
Walpole
actually,
just said
Mr.
the
Martin
opposite
actually
that Mr. Martin was
supported
saying.
Now, hold it.
traditional
There
marriage.
is
There
no
we are.
doubt.
You see, there we
is
have
no
both
doubt
the Liberals
that there
and the
are
Conservatives
differences of
taking the
opinion.
same position,
And clearly
not
those-
willing to
those-
stand up
those
for the rights
differences
of
opinion are going to be
same-sex
debated.
couples. It's
But
back of the
once the
bus,
Supreme
human
Court
rights.
has
And it's
made
not
a
Let me
decision-
just
Mr.
interrupt.
Martin.
I can't hear either one of you. Mr. Martin.
Once the Supreme Court has made a decision, there will be divisions in Parliament, of course there are, but once the Supreme Court has made a decision and said this is a right, then I do not believe that Parliament should use a notwithstanding clause to overturn it. We are a nation of minorities, and if we're not prepared to protect minorities against the occasional oppression by the majority, then in fact what's going to happen is that the basic values of this country will winnow away.
But the real
we
question
have got
on that
to recognize
issue-
But why
that.
don't you take some
And that's
leadership
a
on
fundamental
rights?
part of our
Mr. Martin.
democracy. And the fact that Mr. Harper will not recognize this is, I must say, raises an enormous number of questions as to the basic commitment to the Charter, to the basic commitment to minority rights, and to the basic commitment to our freedoms in this country.
Why wouldn't you
Martin,
support a bill that we
Mr. Martin,
presented
let's-
in the House of Commons to
Pardon me?
prohibit
Let's-
racial stereotyping, Mr. Martin? There was the Liberals spoke up in the House and denied us the chance to vote on a fundamental human rights issue, racial stereotyping. I mean, it's the leadership that people are questioning.
then by
they
all
haven't
means,
seen it.
Mr.
You
bring
could
it-
have
bring it
taken
forth.
it. Was brought forward,
wanted to
sir.
ask a question,
It
Mr.
was
Martin.
brought forward, and you
May I
didn't take
say-
any action. Maybe you'd rather have a question from your friend Mr. Harper. You're
No.
taking the same positions on these issues.
No,
No,
maybe
no,
Go
by
ahead.
me,
I
Feel free
absolutely
to have
am
a
not.
discussion
Now,
amongst yourselves.
Now, Mr. Layton,
I'd like
the
to
fact
ask
is,
one
if
question.
you would like to bring forth a piece of legislation that is dealing with a fundamental human right, I would certainly be
But Mr.
prepared
Martin-
to see
We
the
did that,
debate,
and you
and
weren't
I
there
would
to
take it
support it,
all
and
the way.
Liberals spoke out and
Now,
did
now,
what
Mr.
Mr.
unanimous
Duceppe is
consent,
trying to
sir.
jump in here.
Sorry.
We have
Thank
done
you.
that. It's been on the table in front of us.
Mr. Duceppe is trying to talk.
One thing we know, on the same-sex couple marriage, we know that you're supporting it. I do also. I know that Stephen Harper is against that, but he said he will respect the decision. But you're for the traditional definition of the marriage. You said it. I mean, it's your opinion. But I'd like to know your own opinion, Mr. Martin. What do you think of that?
The fact is that there are three courts. The Court of Ontario, the Court of
I'm
British
not-
Columbia, and the Court of Quebec that have basically decided that.
Your
and
opinion-
I've made my position very clear. This is a question of rights. And when it is a question of rights, the Charter must predominate.
This is not the
and
question.
that will apply
Do you
in every
agree
single
with
instance.
Mr.
that
Martin,
definition?
Mr. Martin, and I would say
Do
to
you agree or not
Hold
with that
it
definition?
just a second.
I would say to you
answering the
and to
question,
the
Mr.
other
Martin.
leaders, the difficulty...
Hiding behind the Charter. The Charter is a
Always-
powerful and
This-
beautiful
Hiding
document.
behind the Charter.
It's a powerful argument.
Just think about
but
that.
what's your opinion, sir?
Okay, now, Mr. Layton,
what is your opinion?
Let me
Why
answer
will
you.
not
Hiding behind the Charter, I certainly
You
will
are
support
trying
the
to
Charter.
avoid taking
what
a
you are
position on
saying
an
is,
issue of
you're-
human
what you're
rights
saying is
by
every bit as bad
referencing
as-
the Charter and
listen.
saying that you won't allow it to be discussed and voted on in Parliament, sir. Why won't you allow this to be voted on in Parliament? What are you afraid of?
Hiding behind the Charter. I cannot believe that. The fact is the Charter is one of the fundamental pillars
be
of our
easier to-
democracy.
Why don't you
And
take
when
some
will
leadership
that
in
kind of
making
a
sure
position-
that those rights are protected,
that is
Mr. Martin?
exactly what I
You
have done.
not done it at all.
Mr. Harper has been trying to get into
Yeah,
this
let me just
conversation.
say it was, these are contentious and complex matters. I'm not sure we can reduce every one of these questions to a question of absolute rights of somebody over somebody else. We have in this country, Mr. Martin, you talk about minorities. Frankly, most new Canadians, most minority groups come here with a pretty high regard for the traditional institution of marriage. They're some of the people who are strongest in defense of this. These are not people who harbor racism or anything else against their fellow Canadians. They simply have a different opinion than you and a couple of judges on the definition of marriage. And I remind you, Mr. Martin, it was in the last election, it was only
I
a
have to
couple
answer
of
this.
years ago. You had exactly
I have
the
to answer
same
this.
position that I have, and now you condemn it, and you condemn it in every cultural
when
group
new
in the
Canadians
country.
come to this country, there's no doubt they had different opinions, but one of the things that they want most of is the freedom to be able to exercise their rights, and that the Charter is incredibly important to the nature of the country that they have come to, and it's very
Gentlemen,
important for them.
we are out of time on this. Thank you all for your answers on this one. That marks the end of our third segment, and our fourth and final area of discussion will be health care. Craig Oliver has a question that each of you will have an opportunity to answer. Go ahead, Craig.
Mr. Layton, I was present at the creation of Medicare in this country in Saskatchewan by your party. Tommy Douglas wouldn't believe what it has come to cover, nor would he believe the way costs have reached what many believe is an unsustainable level of cost. Now, your answer seems to be just keep throwing more money into the pipeline at it, and I wonder what single thing you can suggest to stop Canadians being worried sick about getting sick.
Well, first of all, far be it from me to disagree with Craig Oliver. However, Tommy Douglas, who founded Medicare, as I think you do know, did call for ultimately pharmacare, home care, senior care, advanced public health, because he had a vision of an entire healthcare system, and that is what we're proposing, and that is exactly what we're bringing forward today. And you know, I've met the people whose families are waiting to find out if they've got cancer and wondering whether or not they have to use a credit card in order to get access to it. This is the Liberal legacy of privatized medicine, one that Mr. Harper supports. Our proposal is to expand the services, not to cut taxes, and make health care work.
Okay, Mr. Layton, thank you. Mr. Martin.
If there is any area where there's a requirement for national will, for national leadership, it is in fact bringing together the country together to support this, which is our most important and cherished institution. And the way in which we're going to do this is focus, the single greatest focus has got to be on waiting times. What that really means is that if your child needs an operation, you don't have to sit there in trauma waiting, or if your parent requires a biopsy, that you don't have to sit there and waiting. These are the fundamental issues of the nation, and it is the role of the provinces and the national government coming together to basically deal with the reduction of wait times as the essential element that will reestablish confidence in our healthcare system. Roy Romano had it right, and I agree with him.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Mr. Duceppe.
Well, health costs more and more in each province and in Quebec. The problem is the money is in Ottawa. And the problem is there's a fiscal imbalance that was created by Paul Martin. He's now proposing a 10-year plan to repair a 10-year mess with no expertise at all in Ottawa. There's 10,000 civil servants in Ottawa in the Ministry of Health, and they're managing less than 10 hospitals. Just those figures give the impression of what's happening. And when you see such a mess, you can't conclude anything else than saying we have to respect jurisdiction, give back the money. The money is here, the needs are in the provinces and in Quebec. This is the solution and the only solution.
Thank you, Mr. Duceppe. Mr. Harper.
Well, Mr. Oliver, I guess I'll start by pleading somewhat guilty. Politicians promise more money for health care, it seems, constantly, and I will freely admit I'm doing the same. We've set money aside in our budget to negotiate with the province's implementation of the National Health Accord. We've specifically proposed to deal with the problem of catastrophic drug coverage through a federal program. But one of the reasons I did support the National Health Accord is it talked about performance measures. It talked about ways that we would get on with determining how all these injections of billions of dollars are improving results for patients. And I agree, at some point we've got to stop just throwing money. We've got to get on with implementing this. Mr. Martin did not, but the reality is we have a healthcare system that the vast, vast majority of us, my family, depend on, and we've got to get on with fixing it, and that may involve spending money.
Thank you, Mr. Harper. We'll now begin our one-on-one debates with a follow-up question from David Viano.
Well, let's talk about something that political leaders seem terrified to talk about. That's a private delivery of publicly funded health services. I mean, currently 30% of the healthcare system in this country are funded by private sources, amounting to about $37 billion a year. I mean, the reality is the private sector has a growing role, and I mean, right across the street, or the river in Gatineau, there's private MRI clinics, and nobody's doing anything about it. So why are political leaders afraid to have a legitimate debate on the merits of private versus public? Because it might just provide some of those solutions, say, for example, to waiting lists.
Mr. Layton and Mr. Martin will begin this round. Mr. Layton.
Well, David, I had a press conference in front of that MRI clinic because we think that kind of development of private diagnostics and checkbook medicine, setting up a two-tier system, is wrong. And that's the action we're taking, and we're not afraid to talk about it. It's one of my 8 commitments to Canadians. In fact, we proposed amending the Canada Health Act to make this kind of thing and the growth of it impossible. Secondly, we had a report today from emergency physicians in Canada who said that the legacy of the last 10 years is a 40% reduction in beds and a desperate situation. Now, who was in government in that last 10 years? Mr. Martin, it was you, and it was your cuts. I mean, the scandal of waiting lists is how long we've waited for action from the Liberal Party on this whole issue.
Now, the way in which we're going to deal with this issue is, first of all, to make sure that there's much more public money going into the system to begin with, and second of all, that we're reforming the system from home care to primary care to catastrophic drugs, and obviously focusing on waiting lists. At the same time, we've got to start putting in place a mechanism that will allow us to enforce the Canada Health Act. And that's the proposition that we have made, that in fact, where there is doubt about the Canada Health Act, that somebody should be named by the province, by the federal government, and then a neutral person. Because essentially, justice has to be done transparently and openly.
But Mr. Martin, you promised the same thing in 2000.
We're going to be able to do
the Liberals promised
and
to
under
do
those
something
circumstances,
to stop the privatization
I think that what we'll be able to do is to deal with the very issue that Mr. Viano has risen.
We've had an explosion of private services. You have to admit, it's happened all across the country. P3 hospitals under your watch. Mr. Harper supports it. You let it happen. What's the difference? That's why I say to Canadians, Mr. Martin,
the reason
people
that we
have
put
another choice
a basic
rather
plan
than just supporting
how you do
your
it,
party to block Mr. Harper's idea.
And then what we're doing is we're
saying,
Democrats. Let's put in place the measures.
That's
why.
Hey, gentlemen, we can't hear either one of you. Mr. Martin.
That's why what we've essentially said is, look, let's look at where the problems lie. The problems lie, we haven't developed home care the way that we should. So we've put in a home care incentive program. Then we turned around and we said, now we need to get more doctors. And so what we said was, open up the medical schools, open up the residencies, but at the same time, we want to put in $75 million because there are 1,000 immigrant doctors in this country whose qualifications we won't recognize.
We've proposed to train them before they get here, and that's proactive.
In fact, give
what
them
we're
an
hearing is
opportunity.
more work, more words, more promises, Mr. Martin. People have given up believing Liberal promises in health care. Pharmacare first, more money second, and then home care and everything else. You've promised it before.
Mr. Duceppe and Mr. Harper are next. Mr. Duceppe.
Yes, when we need health care, we should use our health insurance card, not our credit card. We don't want a two-tier system. But we know that if we do have that problem now, it's because of the fiscal imbalance, because there's huge needs in the provinces and in Quebec, and the money is in Ottawa. So I'd like you to tell me if you're ready to eliminate the fiscal imbalance on a long-term basis, and also with very concrete measures in the next 3 years. A way of eliminating it is certainly to apply the Seguin report, which says that we have to transfer the GST to the provinces. Would you agree to do something like that? Because we can talk and talk and talk as long as the money is here, and we don't settle that. I mean, we'll still have the problem, and then we'll have more and more privatization of the health care.
Well, first of all, Mr. Duceppe, I've made specific commitments to move money towards provinces and municipalities. We have a pretty serious problem in this country where we all know provinces are struggling with health care. We all know municipalities are struggling with infrastructure. We all know that we are overtaxed, and Quebecers are some of the most overtaxed people in the Western world. But we have a federal government at the same time that's rolling in money, that has money for HRDC boondoggles, for sponsorship programs, for fiascos in a gun registry. So we agree on that, Mr. Duceppe, where what I say I will do is, as Prime Minister, there's no easy solution. We have to sit down with the provinces and municipalities and try and negotiate this. I recognize the problem. I'm prepared to make some significant shifts. But we also have important responsibilities at the federal level for national defense, foreign affairs, the economic union, the monetary union, federal infrastructure. So I just can't stand here and promise off the top that I will give billions of dollars to any report that comes out of any provincial government. But I will, Mr. Duceppe, recognize the problem and do my best to have a collaboration with the provinces. And that's how a federal system works.
But my question was very clear. Mr. Seguin is proposing that the GST goes to the provinces and to Quebec instead of staying in Ottawa. That'd be the way to have a stable and predictable
but Mr.
way
Duceppe,
of financing
we have
health
to
and
find
education.
stable and predictable funding. But in fairness, you're not going to be in power, and it's easy to just sit here and say, well, scrap the GST federally and move it to the provinces. I mean, scrapping it before has been promised. That's not realistic.
So you're
Gentlemen,
saying no.
We're out of time. Mr. Layton and Mr. Duceppe are next. Mr. Layton.
Well, what we're looking for is an investment. And our plan in the NDP program, because we're not proposing to cut taxes the way we see Mr. Harper doing and the way Mr. Martin has done in the past, and we're not proposing to reduce debt the way Mr. Martin is suggesting. That's his biggest spending item in his platform. He doesn't talk about it much now. He did happily at the Board of Trade in the fall, that was going to be the big focus. We say it's health care. And that's why we have responded with a proposal that says we will meet 25% of all of the provincial costs that have been laid out by the premiers. That is by far the most advanced step forward in the funding of health care that you can see. And the emergency physicians in their report today indicated that it is a problem of financing, and I think we can agree that that is fundamental.
Okay, but the question is not reaching Romano's goal at 25%. The question is, how will you reach that goal? Will you give money to provinces and to Quebec under a certain number of conditions? Or will you do like Mr. Seguin is saying, give back the GST to the provinces? I mean, this is quite different. If you want to have a stable and predictable financing of the health and education system also, because there's problem there also, you have to have that stable and predictable. Not to wait for money coming from Ottawa under a certain number of conditions and national standards. And when I look at your program, I mean, it's we can compare it with the Liberal. I mean, you're doing the things faster than the Liberal, but I mean the same philosophy.
Much faster, and you would admit.
But it's the same philosophy.
We will actually.
Mr.
Duceppe, we will actually do them. They say they're going to do things
but
slowly.
What
and
will
then
you
don't.
do? This is my
and
question.
This is what we've suggested.
It's always Ottawa knows best.
No, not in our case, because we're providing a
so
complete
are you
opting
ready?
out.
Are
we're
you
providing
ready?
a complete opting out approach for provinces that don't want to participate. Completely 100%.
This is not my question. Are you ready to give back the GST to Quebec?
No, our approach to GST.
So this is
our
a very
approach
clear
to
question.
GST is to take the GST off. We don't agree with the GST.
So you'll eliminate the GST?
No, we're proposing to take it off family essentials first. We can't afford to eliminate it
That
completely.
I know. It's not,
and that's very important to families. You may wave your hand, Mr. Duceppe, but you know, when families are buying drugs over the counter,
I fully agree with
buying
that. We do have that also, but I'm
we are
asking
proposing that's the
will
way to
you-
handle the GST.
will you
to
give back the
gradually
GST
phase-
to Quebec?
We
You
want to
Gentlemen,
gradually reduce,
we are
Mr.
out of
Duceppe.
time.
It wouldn't be a stable source.
We're
under
going
our
to shift now
approach.
to Mr. Harper and Mr. Martin. Mr. Harper.
Yeah, thank you. Last night I asked Mr. Martin whether our health care was better or worse than it was in 1993, and he gave an equivocal answer. Tonight I guess I have just a more simple question, which is a fact that waiting lists that, Mr. Martin, you promised to reduce, you've promised before, but waiting lists have doubled over the course of your government the past 11 years. Do you accept responsibility for these kinds of problems in the healthcare system?
Mr. Harper, the healthcare system is better in some areas and it's not better in others. The fundamental issue is, where does your priority lie?
Do you accept responsibility
if you take
for
a
any
look
of
at
that?
your program, you will not be able to fulfill your program given the huge tax cuts, your huge military spending. The fact is that the numbers that you have put out have a huge $50 billion black hole. You will not be able to fulfill your promises. And to break your promises in terms of health care, I've got to say, Mr. Harper, is really a terrible thing when you look at the huge responsibility that we all have as governments to make sure that people can live up to it. The other problem
Mr. Martin,
Mr. Harper,
let me address that, Mr. Martin.
you are,
let me
in
address
fact,
that.
you want to be
Let
the
me
Prime
address that.
Minister
You
of the
made an
country.
accusation.
Now,
Let me
what
address
Mr.
it.
Harper wants to do as the Prime Minister of the country is essentially devolve all of this power to the provinces. Well, I'll tell you something. I believe that the federal Prime Minister has a responsibility in terms of the health care system. He must work with the provinces, but he also sets the great national goals of the land.
Mr. Harper, we'll let you respond.
I'd like to respond on both those fronts. First of all, Mr. Martin, I've made it clear repeatedly, even tonight, through the past 2 years, something you've hedged on, which is I support the National Health Accord, which was signed by all provincial governments and the federal government. I think we do have responsibilities to work collaboratively on this. And the federal government has important healthcare responsibilities that it exercises alone, such as drug approval and drug regulation, drug pricing, which is one of the reasons I propose a federal catastrophic drug program. But, you know, you try and pick on my numbers, Mr. Martin. We are going to try and control federal spending. In the last mandate, you increased departmental spending with your huge surpluses that you created through health care cuts. You increase departmental spending faster than healthcare spending, and your budget would do that again. Your proposals would do that again.
The only way,
my
Mr. Harper,
is
that you
healthcare,
can be credible,
not general departmental
just a second.
spending.
You've asked a question. The only way you can be credible is, in fact, you tell us where you're going to cut. You've got to cut $50 billion. If it's not in health care,
cut $50
then
billion.
tell
We're not
us
going to
where
spend
it's
as
going to come
fast as
from.
you're going to spend.
Then you're going to cut.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Layton and Mr. Harper are next. Mr. Layton.
Well, it's interesting that we hear about the signing of the Health Accord, and it was actually a fascinating moment in the House of Commons because both the Liberals and the Conservatives were getting up and applauding. And I remember Mr. Harper explaining why he was getting up to applaud this accord, And, of course, the funding in it was inadequate. The provinces were starving for money and had to sign virtually anything. If you talk to any of them now, they're very disappointed at the evolution of this. No question about it. We're the only one meeting their full target for funding. But it was because Mr. Harper said the privatization, the so-called choice for health care, that's the buzzword, by the way, whenever you hear it with respect to health care, that's what it has to do with, privatization. And of course, Mr. Harper, to give him credit, he's totally upfront about this. He thinks that's a good thing. We don't think it's a good thing, and we're saying that the Canada Health Act should be amended in order to prevent the expansion of private hospitals so that investors and CEOs are making decisions about health care instead of doctors working with their patients. And that's a strong stand. No other parties take it.
But Mr. Layton, you thank you for crediting me with being clear, but you are being unclear because you lump together under privatization all kinds of different developments. When you express concern about things not being covered any longer by public health insurance and being taken over by the private sector, these are concerns that I share. Our public, universal system of public health insurance has to cover genuinely necessary essential medical services for everybody.
But that would mean public money going to private operations.
Well, I don't agree with
for-profit.
But I don't agree with that.
None of it will go to for-profit operations.
I don't agree with taking it out of public insurance. What you disagree with, where we disagree, and people should understand this. I know this is a dangerous subject. My advisors say don't talk about it. But the fact is that sometimes provinces have allowed, in the past few years, they've brought in private services covered by public health insurance. Ordinary people can get them. Why do I care, and why do we care as a federal government how they're managed? What we care about is whether people can access them.
We care
This
greatly.
is just an ideological agenda.
Absolutely not. There's a major study just released. In fact, one of the authors we're fortunate enough to have as our candidate in the Hamilton area that showed that the cost of the delivery when it's put through these private operations is dramatically higher.
These cost questions have to be managed by provincial governments.
That may be something you'd enjoy to the investors in these American multinational health operations.
How we run public insurance is a provincial matter. You're going to shut down all these publicly insured services.
Hardly.
Mr. Martin and Mr. Duceppe are next. Mr. Martin.
Well, I think there is one fundamental issue where Mr. Duceppe and I disagree. I think there's no doubt that more money has to go into the healthcare system. I think it's got to go into home care. I think it has to go into primary care. But the fact is that you can have common objectives. You can work with the provinces, and it doesn't mean interfering in their jurisdiction. Fundamentally, what Mr. Duceppe wants is to get the federal government to simply turn over the money and get out of the healthcare system. If we did that, then we would have a balkanized system. We would have 10 different systems across the country. We wouldn't have a national health agency to deal with infectious diseases coming in. We wouldn't be able to coordinate research between our great universities. The federal government has a role to play in health care. It's not the primary deliverer, but it does have a role in establishing the great objectives that all of the healthcare systems can work together. And that's what's happening with Quebec. Dr. Couillard in Quebec understands that and is an active participant, and he's got a great deal to offer. So we should work together.
Dr. Couillard is refusing to participate in some of the institutions that are, in which the other provinces are part of.
Absolutely not.
Of course, yes.
Well, let me give you an example.
Let me answer.
Let me just answer your question, if I just for a second.
I was
Dr.
talking,
Couillard.
Mr.
Okay,
Martin,
fine.
okay.
But let me answer it, please.
Later on, take your time.
Fine.
So, Mr. Couillard said he doesn't agree at all with the proposals made by Ottawa. He said he wants money with no conditions. Jean Charest said the same thing. Mr. Pelletier said the same thing. Mr. Séguin said the same thing. So, and it is not a sovereigntist government. May I remind you that? I mean, it's a liberal government under Jean Charest, and they disagree with you on the vision you do have. I mean, there's 5 principles for the health system in Canada. Quebec's respecting them. We agree to respect those 5 principles, but we don't want new structures. We don't want new institutions. We don't want new statistics.
Now may I answer
we want
your
money
question?
for the nurses, for the doctors,
you asked me to answer
for the
question,
employees
Mr.
in
Duceppe.
hospitals,
Let me just tell you.
For the patients.
The fact is that we've set up a health council, which is a national health council.
Quebec's not participating
Quebec
to that.
has set up a health council. And what's happening is that they work together because we both
Quebec's
agree
not
that what you
participating
have
to
to
that.
do
You know
is be
that as well
accountable
as I do.
to your people. That's what's essentially happening. Quebec and the rest of the country, in terms of home care, in terms of
Quebec's
primary
not
care, has
participating
exactly
to
the
that.
same vision. So don't try to put obstacles
Gentlemen,
in the way of the
we
nation
have to end
working.
it there because we're moving to a wider debate with all four of you on a related issue. Keith Bogue has a question, and Mr. Layton, you will begin the debate, please.
So you all agree that health care is the number one issue, and clearly there are differences in your positions, particularly around the issue of private delivery of public health care. Given that there is certainly a real possibility that the result on June 28th will be a minority government, some people now even think that's likely. What is the danger that this issue will get shoved off the agenda because there are such disagreements between the four of you, and there is no majority government to show leadership in solving the problem?
Well, my point tonight, Keith, actually, and thank you for the question, is to say that we still have an opportunity. Canadians have an opportunity to make a choice. Despite Mr. Martin's claims that there's only two parties that can become the government, which I find, I have to say, objectionable. It's taking the voters for granted once again, and haven't we seen that play before from the Liberal Party? And, of course, people do want to see the agenda, many people, the agenda that Mr. Harper proposes, privatization, cutbacks, big tax cuts. They want to see that rejected. They've seen that from Mr. Martin in the past. So what we're offering is 8 commitments to Canadians. And one of those commitments is that we innovate and invest in health care. And you've seen that we have the most ambitious plan there. I'm very excited about it. I think Canadians are excited about it. And we're saying that we will stop the privatization that is going on with an amendment to the Canada Health Act. And that, because it's one of our commitments, is what we will take forward, whether we're a government, an NDP-led minority government, and having a significant central role in Parliament that way, or in opposition. It doesn't matter. We'll bring it forward strongly. I'd like to see if any of the other parties would support that amendment to the Canada Health Act that would protect it from the privatization we've seen.
I came into this election campaign seeking a mandate to put in place a 10-year health care fix for a generation. I met with the provinces on 2 occasions, and that's what the provinces are looking for. I've basically said we will put the money up to meet the Romano gap, and then we will put in place an escalator. The number one priority is reduction of wait times. Now, I am prepared to work with anybody, any province, any political party, any group of medical providers to achieve that goal. I believe that it is incredibly important that, in fact, we reestablish complete confidence in the healthcare system. I think that the reduction of wait times is the way to do it. And I do believe that that's the Canadian will. I think it's the responsibility of the Canadian Prime Minister to express that will. And I feel very, very confident that that's what Canadians want us to do. And I believe ultimately Parliament must follow the will of Canadians when they want to establish those kinds of social programs.
Say Mr. Martin spent 10 years causing the problems and now wants to spend 10 more years fixing them. I think we should have got on with fixing them through the National Health Accord. But in answer to the question, I would suggest there's some considerable ground here between us on this, no matter what the outcome of the election. I think there are a couple of in terms of if I face these situations, I want to make clear, I think there's a couple of things that are different. Mr. Layton proposes changing the Canada Health Act to force provinces to shut down some kinds of publicly insured services. That is not something that I'm going to do. It's not in our interest.
Harper,
and Mr. Duceppe,
the growth. We were very clear on that.
And Mr. Duceppe, and I believe Mr. Duceppe is fully committed to health care, but I think Mr. Martin is accurate in saying Mr. Duceppe simply wants the federal government out of this entirely. And the federal government has important roles, and we have an accord. And that is just not acceptable, Mr. Duceppe. And no matter how many seats you get, you will not, a separatist party will never be dictating to any responsible government of Canada.
I'll tell you something. I'm the only one who knows that I'll be in the opposition. 2 out of 3 will be with me. But I know. So, and Quebecers know also. What we'll do, and we'll do it a responsible way, as we always did in the House of Commons, is to represent Quebec's interest, to defend Quebec's interest, and to defend Quebec's consensus. When there's a unanimous decision made at the National Assembly in Quebec, we're there to tell Ottawa that Quebec wants this or that. And it is our duty.
But Mr. Duceppe...
Let me finish on that. When Mr. Charest, Mr. Pelletier, Mr. Couillard, Mr. Seguin came in Ottawa, there were a lot of deception for the last conference you have held. Same thing with your last budget. I mean, Mr. Charest was very clear, deception. So I think, and all of them, the 3 parties in Quebec, are saying that health is a matter of provincial jurisdiction. We do respect the 5 principles, period. We want the money back.
Well, Mr.
for
Duceppe, we
that
have a
jurisdiction.
cooperative accord between the provinces and the federal
Fine.
government.
No problem with that.
With respect, well, let's talk about that, because with respect, you say you will always be responsible. With respect, Mr. Duceppe, all the provinces a year and a half ago agreed to that, including the government of Quebec, and as I recall, it was a PICUS government, and yet
Of course.
you condemned
I don't deny
the accord
that.
in the House
Not
of
at all.
Commons.
We said in the House there was not enough money.
I led the
and
only
just like
party
Mr.
that
Layton
supported
said,
that accord.
They were forced to sign. I mean, there was no money at all in the provinces. And all of the provinces wanted more money.
Well,
so we don't think it was the agreement that should have been made.
We can put in more money, but we can't always just say there has to be more money. Sometimes we have to move towards some
innovation
solution.
and new ideas. And you know where a lot of those are found? It's actually not in the healthcare system itself. It's in dealing with the causes of disease in the first place. And that has to do with tackling some of the environmental challenges we have. Climate change, cancer caused by pollutants. Dealing with all of these issues needs to be put to the forefront and has not been a part of this debate the way it should have been, quite frankly. And we're very proud of our environmental plan because we're going to be taking strong action.
We want to pass the first Federal Clean Air Act.
Canadians want to see it happen.
We want to see a federal catastrophic drug program. We want to see additional investments in amateur sport and fitness in this country from the federal government,
and we want to participation.
And we want to make it easier for people to use alternative health products, and we specifically promise to fund some of those initiatives.
How can you want to deal with the health problems that arrive out of the environment and climate change, as you just said, when you've already said that you don't accept the science involved in climate change? The fact is,
I said we've got an immediate problem with pollution. That has to be addressed.
Well, Mr. Martin, why didn't you take action if you agree with the science?
We are out of time on all of this. That marks the end of the final debate session, and we're going to move now to your closing statements. You will each have 1 minute, and I will keep you to time. And we begin with Stephen Harper.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, this election is about choosing a government free from scandal, a government that will be accountable, and a government that can be trusted. The Liberals have created 2 Canadas. One is a Canada of privilege for Liberal insiders. The other is a Canada of high taxes for honest, hard-working Canadians. Our new Conservative government will have a balanced approach focused on some key priorities. We will invest in a healthcare system that measures and delivers better results. We will reduce taxes for middle-class Canadians, for families, and for Canadians on low and fixed incomes. And we will restore our military and protect our men and women in uniform. And we will respect the real values Canadians expect from government: hard work, honesty, and accountability, all of the things they have not seen from Mr. Martin tonight. On June the 28th, you have the opportunity to demand better by voting for a new Conservative government.
Thank you, Mr. Harper. Jack Layton.
Well, over the next 2 weeks, you're going to hear the other parties tell you who to vote against. And you know, I think that kind of old thinking only leads to a lot more disappointment. And I believe you deserve something better, something worth voting for. And that's what the NDP is about, some positive ideas. And so this is my pledge to you. Give the NDP a central role in that new parliament and watch things happen. We'll fight to make things better for you. We'll clean up the ethical mess in Ottawa, and we'll fight for the things that matter to you. You know that we will. Healthcare, environment, the other issues like education, our cities and communities of all sizes. You've concluded that the record of scandals, broken promises doesn't warrant a 4th term, and you're worried about the reckless tax cut agenda and the Star Wars Bush-oriented focus of Mr. Harper. So if you believe that politics should be about something positive, then I ask you to support the New Democratic Party on June the 28th. You're the ones who will decide who will be this government, not the leaders of these other parties with their theories and strategies.
Thank you, Mr. Layton.
Make a difference.
Gilles Duceppe.
For months, I've been asking Paul Martin the same questions about the sponsorship scandal. Who was the political direction at the head of the sponsorship scandal? Who are those ministers who knew? Are they still members of the federal cabinet? And will he make public the report on the dirty money that the Liberal Party received from their friends in the sponsorship scandal? Paul Martin, up until now, has refused to answer those questions. Well, it is your duty, sir, to make things clear. You'll talk about transparency. You have to be transparent tonight. You refuse in the French debate to tell us the truth. And I ask you again tonight, and you refuse. Well, the time has come for you to be transparent. I ask you, Paul Martin, you have 60 seconds. Tell us the truth. Tell the truth to the Canadian population. It's your turn, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Duceppe. Paul Martin.
On June 28th, Canadians will have some very different choices based on a very, very different set of values. In the case of health care, as an example, that is our number one priority, and waiting times, the reduction of waiting times, is our number one priority within health care. For Mr. Harper, it's tax cuts and military spending. I believe that staying out of deficit is essential to the kind of strong economy that we have now, one of the strongest in the world. Mr. Harper would have us plunge back into deficit, or certainly run the risk thereof. I believe in Kyoto. I believe in environmental ambition. Mr. Harper not only would renege on Kyoto, he doesn't even accept the science that is there. I believe in the Charter of Rights. I believe in protecting a woman's right to decide. Mr. Harper would have Parliament take away those rights. He thinks that the Charter is fundamentally flawed. Taken together, these are two very different notions. I will fight for my vision and the Liberal vision of Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Martin.